Check, check. Check, check. Check, check. Check, check. Check, check.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Mulch and Compost for Waterwise Gardens, presented by the Waterwise Community Center. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I am the Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center, and am looking forward to presenting this workshop to you today. A quick note before we get started is that you can download all of the slides in this presentation at the web address right here, cbwcd.org/presentations. That's a long list and links to the ability to download a single PDF with all of the slides included of all of the past presentations we've done over the last couple of years. So if you want to refer back to anything or get any of those pictures, you can get them there. There is also a recording of this workshop if you want to go back and re-reference anything, available on our workshops playlist on our YouTube page, which you can get to at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And I'm going to type those addresses into the chat right now in case you want to go back and refer to them later. Great. So moving on, before we get started, I want to tell you just a little bit about the organization that I come from. We are the Waterwise Community Center. Our formal name is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a public agency. Technically, we're a special district, so similar kind of to a school district or a fire district. And we are a very small public agency that was created by a public vote in 1949 to provide water conservation services to the western edge of San Bernardino County in Southern California. We say that our mission is threefold: to percolate, demonstrate, and educate. Percolation has kind of long been the bread and butter of our agency. We own and, in coordination with other local water agencies, operate a series of infiltration basins, which are essentially large holes in the ground. Many of them, or most of them, are literally old gravel pits, which have been redesigned and re-engineered to capture stormwater running off of our communities that would be exiting through our channelized creek systems, and capturing that water, allowing it to fill these infiltration basins and be cleaned through natural processes as it trickles down through levels of soil, and eventually helping to recharge the groundwater table, which is really important because groundwater provides about 60% of our local water supply in our area. Some of those basins, also in collaboration with other agencies, infiltrate recycled water as well as occasionally imported water when it's available to help recharge our local groundwater. And so that's sort of how we contribute to the supply side of water conservation. But on the demand side, we also know that we need to make sure that water is being used wisely as possible in our communities. And in our area, 60% or more of the water is used in the outdoor landscape. And so on the consumption side of water conservation, we are here to demonstrate and educate. If you live anywhere nearby, we have a beautiful, about a 3-acre demonstration garden open for free 6 days a week, where you can see many different approaches to water-wise landscaping that is beautiful, provides things like habitat and other benefits, and also is perfectly suited for dry Southern California. And then we also do lots of education for all sorts of different groups, from curriculum integrated K through 12 field trips to programs for our local community members, where we will help them with design for water-wise landscape transformation projects or consult on irrigation system setup. We also do lots of free online workshops like this, as well as sometimes in-person workshops, although those are currently on hold. And we do training for landscape professionals as well. The easiest way to stay up to date with everything that we have going on is to sign up for our once-a-month email newsletter, which you can easily do at cbwcd.org/newsletter. And then I'm going to introduce myself just a little bit more, so you know a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this topic today. For those of you who are just joining us, I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center. And I have kind of been all around the landscape industry, In my career, my formal education is in landscape architecture. And while landscape design is kind of my niche and specialty, I've pursued that through kind of practical on the ground applications, which has also included working full time in landscape maintenance as I was starting in the industry, and then also working in a public garden setting, doing construction management and landscape maintenance management, as well as design and project management. And so through all of that, one of the things that is a constant is so much in landscape all comes back to soil, whether it's really needing to promote rich, biologically active soil to grow great vegetables in the most water efficient manner, or whether it's coming to appropriate mulching for weed abatement and slow but steady long-term soil improvements when needed in more kind of general landscaping situations. And so I've done a lot of training, a lot of experimentation with different approaches to what we're going to talk about today, both in large scale commercial settings, as well as in my home gardens over especially the last 16 years or so. So that's a little bit about me. I'm really happy to present this topic to you all. And now is going to be a chance, before we get into the outline for today, for you all to tell me just a little bit about who you are. So I just launched a poll in your Zoom interface, and please go through and just click on the appropriate answers for each of these. We'll give just a couple of minutes. Some of them just give us the program metrics that we need for tracking our programs. And then towards the bottom, there's a little bit more topic specific content, which we'll review together. Lets me know just a little bit about where you are in relationship to coming into this class. See, people have started to finish the polls. We'll give just another minute or so for everyone else to complete it. For those of you who are from other areas other than our local listed areas, you are very welcome. We're happy to have everyone here. However, when you fill out the rest of it, it would be great for you to share where you are from. We have people from all over the place: Central California, Montreal, Arizona, north of England, Hacienda Heights, much closer, Wyoming, Texas, and then lots of people in our local community as well. Welcome, everybody. From the Ukraine, oh my gosh. What time is it in the Ukraine? All the way from the UK. Welcome, everybody. So everything we talk about today related to compost is going to apply to you wherever you are. Lots of what we talk about today related to mulch will, but because we have so many people from all over the place, I will also do my best to throw in some little tidbits about kind of any things that might be more Southern California specific, or how I've also seen these techniques used, or where I've seen them used in other areas as I've traveled to public gardens in different climates, different parts of the world. Okay, so don't worry if you haven't finished the poll. I'm going to end it up now so we can get going. And let's just take a quick look at some of the results. At the beginning is just for program tracking, but very welcome to everyone who has joined us for the first time. Thanks for letting us know where you found out about us. And so this is really what I want to get to. So do you currently have mulch in your planting areas at home? If so, what type? So almost half the people here don't have any mulch in your yard. So this class is very much for you, but it's also interesting to know where people are starting with. And for those of you who are just getting started with mulching or maybe not confident in your technique, we will definitely go way into all of the ins and outs and guide you on making your best choices. And then composting. So about half of you don't compost at all at home. So I will be presenting what I have found after trying many different kinds of composting and studying composting, talking to lots of other people about composting, visiting systems large and small. I'm really going to be showing you, after talking about important concepts, what I have settled on as what for my partner and I is the most practical home composting method. So about a quarter of you do compost, but don't feel very confident or successful. So we'll be providing hopefully the recommendations that you need to pull your composting technique together, maybe make some positive changes, and we should have plenty of time to answer your compost question and answers. And about 10% of people feel like they're constantly getting good results. That's great. And okay, most people are equally interested in both mulch and compost topics, and a few people are more interested in one or the other. Okay, that's great. And so what we are going to do is, with that, we will move on to our outline for today. And so I will present it in this order because the mulch is kind of simpler, and then we will build to compost where we get a little bit more into science and biology without getting too technical. And so we'll talk about what mulch and compost are, just kind of getting those definitions out of the way. We'll talk about mulch types, sources, how to choose and how to use mulch. We'll talk about types of compost and composting. We'll talk about my recommendations for what I feel are the best ways to use compost. We'll talk about compost containment options. And then I'll finish with kind of walking you through my recommendations for containers and procedures for composting and worm composting. Basically, after trying all sorts of things, what I have settled on as practical, maintainable with consistently good output. Quick note about how best to interact with me, and ask questions today is. So we have a large group. We have 93 people currently with us, which is awesome. With that large group, the best way to submit any questions is you're going to see a Q&A button in your Zoom interface. And if you click that, it launches a window where you can type in a question. And that's different from the chat function, which is another thing where you can type in. For questions, please use the question and answer function because that's really easy for me to keep my eye on. And what I do is as questions come in, I keep my eye on them. And then when I'm transitioning between sections and have a good break, I'll catch up on all the questions that have come in. With a large group like this, I will need to keep the questions that I answer as we are going through to things that are kind of relevant to the topic that we are talking about as we're going. Kind of think, is this question potentially going to be relevant to other people? I'm happy to answer more more personal questions that are kind of like, this is my specific situation. How does that affect me? But I might have to leave those till the end, but I'm happy to stay until a while after our 12 o'clock end time to get as many of those questions answered as possible. And if you have other just kind of general comments as we go along, feel free to put those into the chat. I always read all of those at the end of the class and love to get any sort of feedback. Quick question that came in from Patricia is, can I put the link for the presentation in the chat box? Absolutely. It is, if you scroll up in the chat, the first entry into the chat are the links. And I'm making sure that I spelled that right. Yeah, so they are there. And then a quick question for those of you who have just joined us. Someone asked where I am from. We are in inland Southern California. So the Waterwise Community Center is based in the city of Montclair, and our service area is the whole western edge of San Bernardino County in Southern California. And so that's kind of the lens that we're teaching this through, but many of the concepts are going to be relevant to everybody, no matter where you are. Okay, so with that, let's get into it. So why are we even presenting this topic? Well, using mulch and compost correctly will help keep plants happy. And big part of that is it helps keep, to simplify it, soil in good condition for plants to grow in. They can provide many benefits. Basically, we can use compost and mulch to help provide conditions in our garden and landscape spaces that are a little bit more like the natural conditions our garden plants are adapted to and will really thrive in, because we love to grow plants from all over the place, and we love to do things in our garden which are sometimes slightly different than even how locally adapted plants would grow. So for example, I love growing California native plants, but I don't water a lot, but in the summer I will water just a little bit more than they would get growing naturally, because I want the plants to not shrivel up and go dormant. And I also want a higher survival rate than if it's just a hillside with thousands of plants and it's kind of survival of the fittest. And so we're kind of providing these idealized conditions through our use of mulch and compost if we use them appropriately. So we're going to talk about how to use them. It's not just more compost is better and more mulch is better. We're going to be strategically matching it to the conditions that our plants want. And so if we know a bit about what our plants want and a bit about our options for mulch and compost, we have a great tool to help with our overall gardening success. So some definitions up front. Mulch is essentially anything that covers the surface of the soil. Often it's wood chips. Sometimes use mulch and like wood chip mulch interchangeably as terms, but mulch can also be gravel or decomposed granite are common mulches, 2 or 3 inches of gravel or decomposed granite in Southern California, depending on the plant type. And compost can actually be mulch as well. I use compost kind of as a mulch in my vegetable garden sometimes. Sometimes I use 2 layers, a layer of compost, and then later on in the season, as it gets warmer, a layer of wood chips as well, once the plants are well established in my vegetable beds. What does mulch do? Well, one of the main things that it does in Waterwise gardens or gardens in warm areas especially is it reduces evaporation from the surface of the soil. So when we irrigate, we put water onto and eventually, if we do it correctly, soaks deep down into the soil. But if the sun is beating directly down on the soil surface, not only will that evaporate water from the surface of the soil, which is then no longer available to our plants, but depending on the soil type, soils have an ability to then, they'll kind of want to even out the soil moisture a little bit. So some of that moisture a little bit lower down can wick farther up to the surface as it dries. And then that can kind of evaporate from the warm conditions as well. So putting mulch onto the soil surface where the sun is going to be hitting the mulch and not the soil pretty effectively cuts off that from happening. Mulch will also help prevent weed seeds from germinating. Different mulches have different abilities to do that, and we'll talk about that more later, but it is something that can be helpful. And then finally, if it is an organic mulch, which is usually a wood chip mulch, depending on the type, but a normal common mixed kind of wood source wood chip mulch will break down over time and slowly add organic matter to the soil, improving it. So you need to replace those wood chips, but when you need to replace those wood chips, it's because they have broken down, have slowly been integrated into the soil or are on the soil surface, but broken down and will over time be integrated. And so it's almost like gently and slowly composting in place. Compost is something a bit more specific. Compost is organic matter, so could be woody, could be grass, could be kitchen scraps, anything that can decompose. Compost is organic matter that is broken down in a process called composting. Happens through biological activity of primarily bacteria, fungi, little insects help as well. And compost is used either on the surface or mixed in to enrich the soil with organic matter and nutrients. Organic matter is kind of a superhero in the soil system and has incredible qualities in the soil of helping to hold on to water, make that water appropriately available to plants, and also build certain soils' abilities to hold on to nutrients as well. It also helps build soil structure, which is important. And we'll look at pictures of soil structure later. Compost can feed beneficial soil microbes, which help within the soil food web that we'll talk about later, process nutrients that are not available to plants into plant available nutrients, as well as potentially help some plants protect themselves against pathogens. And compost can be made out of many different organic materials, and we'll provide some guidelines too for home composters. What are the kind of ideal materials to work with? Because you can theoretically compost meat and cheese, but it is very difficult and not really safe for most home compost sorts of systems. So we'll talk about inputs for home compost. And so with that, we're going to start with mulch. We'll cover the mulch part of the workshop, and then we'll go into compost. But have some questions that have come in. And so we will review those questions before we move on. Okay, for those of you who have really specific questions about your specific trees, those will fall into the category of things that I'll kind of be able to answer at the end, but I'm going to be covering more kind of general interest questions as we go. So do I recommend using mulch over seeded areas? If so, how best to determine what's new seedlings versus weeds? That's a good question. Generally for seeded areas, like if you're broadcast seeding over a wide area, scattering seeds, mulch can be problematic, and there's no quick way of understanding if you've never grown these seeds or are not familiar with your local weed types, what is what. It can be very confusing. The best thing to do in that situation is to make sure you've done a good job taking care of weeds first, watering, letting the weeds flush out, removing the weeds, doing that a bunch of times, and then finally putting your new seeds down. Over time, you will learn what your weeds in your area, if you pay attention, look like when you're germinating, and then it's very easy. If you know the names of the weeds in your area, you can try to look that up online, or the best thing to do would be if there's a local person who has been gardening for a long time, they might be able to guide you as well and take a look at things. But weed abatement ahead of time is really the name of the game with that. There's certain wildflower seeds, like native wildflower seeds, that are really strong growers, and you can, if you have like 1 or 2 inches of mulch, you can kind of toss those into the mulch, and they will come up in the fall rains in Southern California, for example. But that's kind of an exception to the general rule. From Laura, can you make your own wood chip mulch from willow, or will it try to root? If you have big sticks of anything, it'll potentially try to root. Well, willow because it's aggressive, but if it's totally ground up into chips, like through a grinder, it should be just fine. So question, biologically, isn't compost a preferable mulch versus wood chips? Depends on what you are trying to do. So if you are growing, for example, native plants to many areas that are already adapted to the soil, so especially thinking in terms of like the Southwest, California, the Mediterranean, we don't generally need, or even we don't want to add those additional nutrients that are in compost. We don't want to push a lot of excessive growth because these plants are already adapted to the lean native soils that we have. And so wood chips in most cases, or sometimes even like a gravel mulch, would be more appropriate. We don't want that like high nutrient, and we don't necessarily need to push that additional biological activity because just the natural level of biological activity in the soil will oftentimes be sufficient. If you're kind of really like on gardening in an area that recently had a huge construction project and the soil is dead, then maybe a little bit of compost could help, but you don't really know if it's going to be the right organisms for native plants as well. So compost is more like fruit trees and vegetable gardens, or high nutrient loving ornamental plants. And there are many other specific questions coming in, and we are going to get to a lot of those as we just present the class. So I am going to move on for now. And so we're going to start by going through different types of mulch and just kind of setting a baseline, because even within organic mulch or wood chip mulch, there's many different types. In some ways, the most common, if you're buying it in bulk, or if you're getting it for free, like from a mulch giveaway program from your local municipality or from a tree trimmer, is basically going to be mixed ground tree trimmings, number of different species, number of different sizes of wood that went into it. Sometimes it'll be very consistent. Sometimes it'll be a little bit varied in terms of the size. Sometimes there'll be some leaves, and it'll be a mix of grinding of small branches, twigs, large branches. This is actually, in the vast majority of applications, if you're going to be using wood chip mulch, what I recommend. It lasts a while, but it does eventually break down. And when it breaks down, it does improve the soil, and you have a variety of different species of plants and wood type sizes. That's especially in terms of like the slow but steady breaking down and feeding the soil, that's really going to give you the best results. You just want to make sure, to the best ability that you can, that you are not using mulch created by grinding up diseased trees, prunings from healthy trees. And so if you're going to be getting that mulch like for free from a tree trimmer, just kind of ask and make sure it's not a takedown of a tree that was taken down because it was diseased. Mixed ground tree trimmings are also available from soil yards or landscape supply yards. And so it's something that if you just know you want, X amount and you want to get it right away, you can often do that. So this is just an example of one of the options from one of our local landscape supply yards. For those of you who are in Southern California or inland Southern California, right in our local service area, at that same website where you can download the PDF of this at cbwcd.org/presentations. You can also download a local landscape suppliers list. So if you are going to be needing to buy mulch, gravel, decomposed granite for your mulching projects, you can find the local sources, or all the local sources that I know of for us in the Western San Bernardino County area, on that list that you can download. And so this is roughly what mixed ground tree trimming mulch is going to look like when you put it down. The color can vary slightly, but normally it's kind of a darkish brown and gives you kind of a natural look. Over time, in a natural style garden, you can start growing and kind of producing your own mulch. And depending on your plant density, so this is a section of my backyard when our planting was still quite young. Today, there's very little open space in this planted area, and then there's just kind of the pathways on the edge. So I no longer I'll never need to remulch this interior area, because over time, plant leaves are dropping, or if I do some pruning, I'll just chop up a little bit just with my hand pruners and add a little bit more here and there. And I'm really only adding wood chip mulch to my wood chip mulch pathway areas outside and on the edge. And that's a great way to proceed once your plants start growing in, for a number of reasons. It keeps green waste on site. You're not putting it to the green bin and having it hauled away to be used. Could be used in a number of different ways, but it's always best to keep what you can on site. It's going to be the best thing for the plants over time. Plants, most of them naturally, are adapted to kind of growing in a light layer of their own leaf litter, more than growing in random species of ground up wood. And so in a naturalistic garden, that's a great way to move forward. And also, it's kind of best for habitat. So for example, when I'm cutting back my native sage plants to clean them up some and prepare them for blooming the next year, I'm also then going to be trimming some of the little flower spikes that still have seeds in it and letting them drop into the mulch layer, some of the flower stems that are hollow, and then some beneficial insects will be, and pollinators potentially will be making their homes inside some of the hollow stems, and a number of different native songbirds will come around to pick the seeds out of the mulch layer on the ground. And some birds are specialists at picking seeds off of the ground. So there's some birds that will go up into the shrubs in my backyard. However, there are some birds that will wait until that seed is on the ground. So creating that kind of own mulch from those plants enhances the habitat value of the yard as well. And you can kind of mix things up, however you want. So here's a picture of, a pathway, but then defining that pathway with some logs and some little cobble and gravel that was just recycled, found on the site. But that all of that as well creates little micro areas in a natural garden that enhances habitat for lizards and other little critters, some of which are food for the birds, and just kind of defines the pathway edge. And so eventually, it's a picture of, some of that growing your own, and you could kind of trim it rough or trim it very finely. And so that's this area when things are young. And then as things have grown in, this is the very end of fall. So the plants look a little bit tired, but I had to do some pruning because one branch had cracked. And so you can see how instead of the wood chip mulch, it's just kind of a very natural leaf litter layer over time. I think this is a beautiful picture of a kind of very natural looking mulch as well. So you can see with the wood chip mulch, this is a picture from a Tree of Life nursery in San Juan Capistrano, amazing California native plant nursery. And so you can see there might have been a wood chip mulch at one point in time, but now it's just a very natural combination of leaf litter, some rocks and stone here and there, and just kind of naturally filling in. To me, this is kind of, for a naturalistic garden, kind of the holy grail of mulching, where especially for California native or Mediterranean climate or low water southwestern plants, really the mulch is primarily just to cover the soil at the beginning of your planting when the plants are small, to help prevent weeds from germinating, to shade the soil some, to keep the soil temperatures down a little bit. And so you only need to put down absolutely no more than 3 inches. And then for the most part, in a naturalistic garden, I won't ever bring in lots of wood chip mulch ever again. It'll be kind of working with the site from there, no more than one additional time. And where to get this wood chip mulch? Well, a lot of different areas have free mulch giveaway programs. And so find out if that exists in your city. City of Los Angeles does. City of Pasadena, when I used to live in the San Gabriel Valley, had a program where throughout lots of the year, there's just a big pile of mulch in a parking lot at a park. And at the Waterwise Community Center in Montclair, that's what we have for a mulch giveaway program as well. So right now, we actually had to change how we do our compost giveaway some because it was disappearing too quickly. But for our mulch, we just have on the north side of our parking lot, pretty much always a big pile of mulch, and people can come, bring your own tools, bring your own containers, just take whatever you want. And it's pretty good stuff. It's what I use at home. It is a nicely, pretty finely ground up mix of local arborist trimmings produced locally. And for our compost giveaway, if you're local and you're interested, we give that away the first and third Saturday of every month on the backside of our property. And the quantities are a little bit limited, but you can still take about 30 gallons a person of that compost material. And if you are interested in that, if you are local, you can get the details. I'm typing the web address into the chat right now at cbwcd.org/mulch, because that's the information for the mulch and compost giveaway program. Definitely for people in Southern California, but I believe the service goes much farther than Southern California. Another option for trying to get free mulch is a service called Chip Drop. It's an app. You can get the information at chipdrop.com. And basically, that is a way of people who want to get large, so full arborist tree trimming trucks, big piles of mulch dropped off at their property. Basically, you could put yourself on an interest list and let local tree trimmers know that if they have a pile of wood chip mulch in a truck and they happen to be in your area, they can drop it off. You basically have to be very flexible on your schedule and have a ready to go place available for them to drop it, where, you know, like this person will need to have commit to the fact that they're not going to be able to get into their driveway until they move that pile. So it's definitely not for everybody. And they're very upfront about the fact that the quality can be variable. So for example, if it's a takedown of a pine tree, there will be lots of pine needles. And so it could be a great way to get a large amount of mulch for free. This is probably at least a 20-yard pile. And so that 20-yard pile, if it was purchased for delivery, you know, you probably would have a little bit more quality control, but that could easily be over $400, $500 for that amount of wood chip mulch. So if you have a large yard, the price could definitely be right. And there's lots of information on their website about figuring out if it is right for you. I do know some people locally who have used it and they have been happy with how it has worked out for them, but definitely do your own research. And some other mulch sources. So we talked about how many landscape materials yards can sell and can deliver mulch. The delivery fees can add up, but if you're doing a large project, it will definitely be more convenient to have a large dump truck of mulch delivered than to be doing it a little bit at a time in a pickup truck. And we'll talk about how much mulch you can move in a truck on the next slide. The materials, the grinds, and the quality of mulch vary. So go in first and check out your options and make sure that it's going to be what you want if you're buying it. Delivery can be cost prohibitive for small amounts. For example, for a cubic yard of mulch, which is basically exactly what fits in an even back of my small Toyota Tacoma pickup truck bed, that is going to cost $20-something at most yards. But the locally around here, the delivery fee for bringing mulch out on a truck, whether you just need a couple of yards or a whole truck, it's about $80. So you really are going to need to cross a threshold of how much mulch you are going to be purchasing in order for it to be really financially viable to get that delivery. Most soil yards or material yards can also load a pickup truck with a tractor. A few will sell individual bags of their same bulk products. However, one note is that, in my opinion, you cannot buy what I generally consider to be good quality mulch at a hardware store or most nurseries, unless there are ones that happen to also have like a big bulk pile where they will also scoop with a tractor and fill up a truck. And we'll talk about some of those products they have available, but for the most part, unless it's for a very specific reason, I really am a fan of that mixed arborist grinding kind of mulch and not like the bark nuggets or other things that they sell at the hardware store for a variety of reasons. So we're going to talk a little bit about pickup trucks for those of you who do have pickup trucks or can borrow one and are thinking about using them for a landscape project. And then we will look kind of type by type at some of those other organic mulches and mulch types and talk about where they might be used. So small pickup trucks like Tacomas, S10s, Ford Rangers, at least as of when I first calculated this, can fit about 1 yard of mulch. And then just in terms of weight and pull, a bit less than half a yard of gravel or decomposed granite. We'll talk about it later. And that's just going to depend on the suspension and the engine as well. So definitely once you get into those other materials, most trucks, you're not going to be able to fill up the whole volume of the truck bed. But for wood chip mulches, you generally can. I will say that all of those small trucks seem to have grown a lot in the last year if you have a newer one. So I wouldn't be surprised if the capacity has grown some as well. I know my Toyota Tacoma fits about a yard of mulch, but it seems tiny compared to the newer Toyota Tacomas. Mid-size pickup trucks with a 6-foot bed, like a Ford F-150, that sort of stuff, generally can do 2 yards of mulch, or depending on things, 3/4 of a yard of gravel or decomposed granite. And full-size pickup trucks with 8-foot beds can generally do 3 yards of mulch, but might not be able to do any gravel or decomposed granite just due to the weight. It's just going to depend on the truck. If you're used to hauling a lot of stuff with your truck, then you probably know what it can handle, and you might be able to figure out exactly what you can do safely. However, especially if you are going to be hauling gravel or decomposed granite, you might be well pushing the weight capacity of what is safe to do in your vehicle. So check that capacity, and you can also generally check with your supplier about the weight of their product, and they will be able to tell you, it'll be this many scoops or this many yards, and here's roughly what it's going to weigh per yard. I definitely know, for example, on my truck, I either will have issues with suspension for me before I run out of, what I can actually, pull with my engine, but also my braking changes quite a bit when I'm hauling heavier materials like gravel or decomposed granite. So remember to drive safely and check your tire pressure, and remember that your brakes are going to respond differently if you are hauling this stuff, especially if you're not used to driving a truck. Really pay attention to that. So a little bit about some other organic mulches, and then I see a lot of questions have come in, so we'll loop back around to questions. So other organic mulches that sometimes you buy in bags, or sometimes are also available in bulk from soil materials yards. Bark nuggets are one that oftentimes around here, it's a cedar product, byproduct of the lumber mills. So that's the nice thing with the bark-based things, is that they're byproducts of the lumber mills. However, they kind of just create a dusty, inert surface, in my opinion, on soil surfaces. So with bark-based products, whether it's shredded bark or bark nuggets, a pro is that they don't break down very quickly. The bark is very low nutrient. It's very tough and resilient. A con is that they don't break down. And over time, sometimes they just kind of desiccate in the soil surface, and they can, I think, more than the mixed arborist ground trimmings in areas where it's dry. Sometimes the bark products, in my opinion, form a little bit more of a water barrier than the other just kind of more general ground mulches do. So if you like this look and you want to do it for a pathway area, that's just fine. In general, it's not going to be one of my go-tos to recommend for a landscape area. Color mulch is something that I can go on a whole rant about. That's the red colored wood chip mulch, or sometimes black or brown. You can see the whole diversity. The hardware stores sell tons of this stuff in individual bags. I don't recommend it for a number of reasons. I would love to tell you that the dyes are toxic, but when I did try to look into that, I actually could not find any evidence that there's anything wrong with the dyes. They do, I think most brands use biodegradable dyes, but still, why would you want to be dyeing the surface of your garden? The wood chips themselves to me, look like they're kind of more of a lumber byproduct than anything that grows in the garden. And in my opinion, it just really very rarely or almost pretty much never looks good in a landscape versus a more natural mulch product. Also, when you're buying these bagged products, you accumulate lots and lots of bags, which is just lots of plastic waste going to the landfill. So if you can get a hold of wood chip mulch in bulk, that's the way to go. Some of the soil yards around here will also sell bag products, and when they do that, they're bagging their own products, and they'll use paper bags. So at least a heavy duty paper bag can then be used either as sheet mulch, so a temporary biodegradable weed barrier underneath your wood chip barrier in an area that's weedy, or can be put into the recycler, or at least will biodegrade eventually. Gorilla hair mulch is another option that you see around. It is quite expensive. It's a fine shredded, normally it's a cedar or redwood bark. And there's a few reasons people use it. One of them is that this gorilla hair does kind of stick together. And so on very steep slopes where typical wood chip mulch might kind of slide down the slope, gorilla hair mulch will remain. So for example, on one of the sides of our building, there is a very steep slope of soil. It's kind of a berm that buries half of our building and then slopes down towards the street. And gorilla hair mulch is the only mulch that will stick on that slope. So currently it has it there. However, I have also worked in landscape areas where gorilla hair mulch is used as the main mulch because people just thought it looked the nicer. It kind of to me looks like the back of a lawnmower ad or something like that in like the color planted beds around a lawn. It is an even dark brown when you put it down. It has a very fine regular surface. It looks totally unnatural, and I guess some people prefer that look. However, I can say in those gardens where they've been using gorilla hair, what happens, it's that same thing I mentioned. There's very little nutrient in it, so it doesn't break down over time. It just sort of desiccates, especially here in dry Southern California, and eventually just fades. And so people want to put more and more on to get that fresh look. And so I've walked into gardens where there's like just 6 inches of this like compacted, nasty, desiccated old gorilla hair mulch. And in those cases, it was kind of smothering the soil. Irrigation would go, especially overhead irrigation, and it would just kind of act like a sponge absorbing irrigation, not letting it down into the soil below. Whereas a normal shredded wood chip mulch, that each drop of water can kind of work its way down generally. It becomes very dusty as it breaks down. It could potentially be flammable. So like you don't want to use it on a slope in an urban wildland interface area. And the individual little fibers on the shredded bark as well, for people with sensitive skin, it's very nasty to work with. It can cause kind of contact dermatitis. So I don't generally recommend it, but it does stick to slopes in non-fire prone areas. And then finally, rubber mulch, which is a thing that they sell at the hardware stores quite a bit as well. I absolutely do not recommend it. It is often made with recycled tires, and with whatever rubber it's coming from, especially with tires, it has all the toxicity issues that those rubbers do. It is toxic and flammable. You definitely don't want to use rubber mulch in an area where you're anywhere near a potential fire area, because it will literally, if it catches, cause basically a tire fire in your garden. That's very hard to put out. Not what you want on your property. I never recommend the recycled rubber mulch. And I don't think it really beautifies landscapes, no matter what it says. Here it's marketing. It won't attract termites, carpenter ants, or other damaging insects. I can say I can't make a blanket statement because I haven't been in every garden, but I have been working intimately in mulch gardens for many, many years, and I have never heard of mulch causing a termite infection. Termites, I believe, mostly stick to kind of larger pieces of wood, and the ground up mulch, I've just never seen it be an issue. Definitely, at least in our dry Southern California climate. And so with that, we're about to be ready to turn over to talking about gravel and aggregate mulches, but I do want to catch up on some questions that have come in. I do see one raised hand. We are doing all the question and answer this workshop because we have almost 100 people here. Through the question and answer functions. When we call on people with raised hands, there's just too much downtime with the audio and stuff. So please type your question into the question and answer function in your Zoom interface. Okay, so some questions that have come in. Okay, here in the Inland Empire, do I know what happens with the green waste that goes out on trash day? It depends on your jurisdiction and the waste management company. The wood chip mulch that we give away does not come through a municipal system. That's actually, there's in Montclair, there's a private green waste drop-off that mostly serves tree trimmers, and it's produced there, and that's the source of the stuff that we are getting donated. Okay. In terms of color mulch, does the black absorb more heat in the summer? Absolutely, it will, and it will reflect more heat out at the end of the day. Are there any specific trees that are better for mulching? In general, you're going to want to have just a diversity of tree species. Eucalyptus is notorious for having a chemical in it which prevents seeds from growing. So you would never want to use eucalyptus mulch in an area where you are hoping for seeds to come up, but some people do like eucalyptus mulch as like a weed preventative. If I have access to it, like I love oak tree mulch, just because I'm working with a lot of California native plants. Oak tree mulch does break down nicely, and it's just kind of something natural to the local kind of bioregion that I'm in. But normally it's just kind of all sorts of mixed stuff is what I use. Question about the depth of mulch, we'll definitely get to that later. Okay. Quick question. Yeah, am I recording this? Yes, this is being recorded, and currently there is a recording of a past version of this workshop available on our YouTube page with all the same content. And if you scroll up to the top of the chat, you can get the links right there. What should you expect to pay for wood chip mulch? It depends on where you are, but in our local area, current prices are in generally for the mixed wood chip type of mulches are in the like low $20 per yard. And so that's about what'll fit in the back of a small pickup truck without it heaped. And if you want those specialty types, the bark nuggets, the things like that, that aren't produced locally and they're more brought in products, even if you're buying them in bulk, the prices go up from there. Let's see. So what's the good mulch for slope surfaces? So it depends on your slope. Again, if you're not in a fire area, I would first try a small area with just that mixed wood chip mulch and see if it works. Especially it depends on your amount of vegetation. If it doesn't work, then you might consider the gorilla hair mulch, just depending on the look and how large it is. But I would really hesitate from doing a huge area, or working on bringing up your plant density some and working with wood chip mulch. Now, in an urban wildland interface area where there is fire danger, there's not a great answer to that, unfortunately, because generally gravels, if it's a gentle slope, a gravel mulch could work. But if it's a steep slope, you're really going to be dealing with plant material and trying to find that right balance between not having too much plant density, but having enough plant density and root density that you're going to be preventing erosion with plants that don't need a lot of water, but can take some seasonal hydration to avoid that wildfire risk. So from Dennis, are there disadvantages to using a mulch of shredded leaves compared to a mulch of shredded wood chips? Shredded leaves break down a lot quicker. I mean, certainly if shredded leaves are, what you have access to, because, you and your neighbors have them, then yeah, go for it. I wouldn't hesitate to use it. All the leaves that fall on my property, I use. But it's just going to break down a lot quicker than a wood chip mulch. So if you're bringing it in and you're wanting it to last for a while, then you're going to probably want to have something with some wood chip in it. And most of the time when the mixed arborist trimmings are made, there's some leaves in it, but those leaves break down very quickly, so you don't see them for long. Okay, so other questions that I will be getting to lately. Are there problems with cedar mulch being toxic to plants? Not that I have heard of or that I'm aware of. Pine tree mulch works just fine. Yeah, and pine is often, one of the things very commonly mixed in mixed mulches. Yeah, I mean, the main thing is kind of use what you have access to. If you have access to decent stuff that's free and it comes from trees that are healthy, then I'll pretty much use anything. Chicken. Okay, I think we are going to. Okay, so one last question, and then all of the other questions for people who have typed them in, we will either be answering them fully or partially, and then it'll be better for me to loop back around to them farther on in the presentation because we'll have a lot more context. So there was a question regarding oak mulch. Does it change the soil environment? I was told not to plant anything under an oak since it sends out chemicals to change the soil. I've not heard that for oak. I've gardened a lot around oaks. Might depend on where you are. Maybe there's a different oak. Oaks can be hard to garden underneath because of shade and root competition, but like walnuts, for example, there are chemicals, it's called allelopathy, that do make it hard for other plants to survive. There's a few that are adapted to it. However, clear thing about mulch, mulch does not ever get mixed into the soil. Mulch is only laid on top of the soil. And so usually it's going to have very limited capacity to change the soil environment unless potentially, maybe if it's something like eucalyptus where there's an oil in it that does something and it's like many, many years of just eucalyptus in the same spot. But oak mulch is great. The plants that I grow in oak mulch love to grow. So that's my go-to. If I could, have consistently, although I do like diversity, but if I just had to choose one plant, I'd probably go with oak. So not something I would worry about, but again, it's not being mixed into the soil. If you mix wood chip mulch into the soil, what happens is that all the little soil bacteria, wood chips are a lot of carbon. So if you mix wood chip mulch into the soil, all this bacteria really goes to work on breaking down all that carbon. It's like a huge buffet for them. And as they do that, they will actually lock up nitrogen just in terms of the chemical processes that are going to be happening within their own biomass. And so plants start all of a sudden to become nitrogen starved in that soil. It's temporary because eventually once all that carbon in that wood chip is broken down, that spike in the bacterial population will die and that nitrogen will be re-released. However, that can last quite a while. So it's something that you absolutely want to avoid, applying it to the top. And that's one of the misconceptions that I find about mulching with wood chips. So there's just kind of out there that it will among some people still, that it will deprive the soil of nutrients, even if you just put that wood chip mulch on the top, which from my mentors that I've learned about, some of which have spent their careers in the commercial orcharding industry, where nutrients are super important to fruit tree production, and in some cases they do use mulches. Basically, what I was taught from them is that it is true that as in soil kind of wood interface, as the bacteria goes to work, nutrients do get locked up, like I said. But if you're only putting that wood chip mulch directly on the top of the soil, not mixing it in, the interface area where that specific relationship is happening is super thin. It's only at the very, very top of the soil surface. And through the root zone of the soil, that's not occurring. So things are just fine. And then finally, I think last question on, okay, two last questions, and then we will move on because we need to keep going. There's a lot to cover. So how much area? Okay, we will answer that later. Sorry. Experience thoughts on using hay or straw as mulch. So that is done in certain areas, especially in agricultural areas where it is just around. So like me in urban Southern California, I've used it occasionally when there's been some old straw bales around, and it works just fine. But I would never go out of my way to actually pay for it to use it, because it's not really going to work better than anything else for us, in my opinion. However, the difference between hay and straw, if you are using it, hay still has the seeds of the grass in it. And if you use hay as a mulch in an irrigated garden, you will get lots and lots of grass germinating, where straw is just the stalk. And so between the two, in general, if you're going to be using them, using straw, but only if that's just what's available to you, because old straw bales are around and available. Okay, and I'm going to keep going for now. There's a lot of great questions, but if I keep answering questions, we'll never get through the presentation. And I want to make sure we get to the other mulches and compost. So keep them coming in if you have them, but some of them I will have to hold to the end. It's great questions, but yeah, we just have to kind of keep going. So now we're going to talk about aggregate or gravel mulch. Same thing. Aggregate just means small rocks. And basically you're usually talking about something like pea gravel, maybe sometimes what's sometimes referred to as bird's eye gravel, or pea gravel will be like a 3/8 of an inch and a little bit smaller sometimes. Bird's eye gravel is sometimes 1/4 inch gravel, generally the same kind of rock, just smaller. In some cases, it'll look nicer, can be harder to find, not as many yards necessarily have it, or a larger gravel. So this is from a landscape materials yard near us, a 1.5 inch gravel. So they also call it their like a drain rock gravel, although that might mean many different things. And all of these gravels that I prefer for us in Southern California, this is the local stone material to where we are. So it's mostly granite. There's a little bit of other stuff mixed in, and it's a gray kind of river rock. Those are our natural kind of rock deposits that we have. And I think that that's generally the way to go, because one, it's going to look the most natural as the local material in our area. Two, it's going to have the lowest environmental impact because we are not importing gravel from another country or across the continent, which does happen. And three, also partially because of all of those things, it's going to be the cheapest. So often, like down here, our local river rock kind of materials are going to cost at some yards like 1/3 as much as the other, quote, more exotic gravels. And those other ones often don't look as natural in our gardens here. So you can always go to your local soil yard and check out the options that they have available. Usually you can get a little baggie of it if you want to take home some and kind of spread it as a test in a landscape area and see how it looks in your yard. One of the things I like about working with our local materials is that you can also, when it's your local material, generally get boulders, cobblestone, and different sizes of gravel, all of matching materials. So you can use all different sizes in your garden and have them look nice. Whereas a lot of the, quote, more ornamental stuff, you are much more limited and sometimes can only get one size. And so you don't have a lot of options in terms of how to use it in your landscape. Here is another one that's kind of, this one does come from the California deserts and is sometimes used. And I have used this occasionally in a project. This is called California gold. Sometimes you see a pyrite gold gravel, but these are generally at least 2 to 3 times more expensive. And I don't really feel necessarily like look any better. In fact, I feel that they often don't look as good in our landscapes. So for example, here at most soil yards, this is the only size you can get of this stuff. And so you don't have a lot of opportunities to work with different sizes of material to get a natural look. Whereas maybe in the desert areas where this comes from, you can get most of those different sizes. And so when we talk about a gravel mulch, we are not talking about this, where it's just necessarily one size of gravel and then a few plants. And these plants, like daylilies here, aren't adapted to, they want kind of a lush, kind of a more organic soil. They'd be much happier in wood chips than in gravel. So this is not necessarily what we are talking about, wall-to-wall gravel. We're definitely not talking about this black gravel that's going to absorb tons and tons of heat and radiate it back. This poor tree is just never going to be happy. This, in my opinion, is what gravel mulch done well looks like. This is a local garden that was put in by a homeowner close or within our service area. And so take a look at this. It's gravel, but it's different sizes of kind of matching material. There's working in stone, and you might not have the ability to put in a large boulder like this, but working in different sizes to create a naturalistic effect. And then working in here, there's the flagstone path with the small gravel in between, some more rocks and boulders here along the dry stream bed, and a little area of decomposed granite mulch, which we'll talk about next, which is kind of completes, working in some stone, this very naturalistic look made by getting some different sizes of compatible material. You definitely want to, if you're going to be working with gravel mulch, or want to be working with plants that are adapted to gravelly, washy areas or lean soils. So most of our Southern California native plants, whether they're chaparral plants or desert plants, are going to be adapted to a gravel mulch. But fruit trees don't want gravel mulch. They want rich soil. So when we see people sometimes around here planting citrus trees with gravel mulch underneath, those are not going to be happy long-term in most situations. They'd be much better off with a wood chip mulch. You're generally talking about Mediterranean or dry land adapted native plants. But yeah, for your lavenders, your rosemaries, things like that, those could be okay with a gravel mulch as well. One thing to consider is that there is more what's called thermal mass in gravel mulch than wood chip mulch, which means that if it's in full sun and the sun is hitting it all day, it will absorb that heat. Because it's often lighter colored, the surface temperature isn't necessarily any higher than the wood chip mulch, like midday, but even in the evening when it starts to cool off, what's called the thermal mass of the rock, and it's kind of the same concept like concrete, still going to be hot in the evening on a hot day, will continue to radiate heat back outwardly. So in Southern California, if we are doing landscapes like this, especially near the house, shade as well is super important. So like in this picture, this young tree here, a Palo Verde, eventually will be 25 to 30 feet tall and wide and will shade a good portion of this near the house. And so even though it's gravel, it's not permanently going to feel hot, dry effect. And then if you are also thinking about lots of, big area of gravel that's light colored without trees, remember that there's going to be glare as well. So some things to consider. Benefits of it is that it's going to be there forever. It's rock. So it's not like wood chip mulch where it needs to be kind of replaced over time. It's going to stick around. And then our other inorganic mulch, as opposed to the organic wood chip mulch that's commonly used, is decomposed granite. And this is the stuff, it's often used as pathways, like in public parks or for walking trails that are like semi-paved. They're not gravel, but they kind of have a little crunch under the foot, feel natural. They're generally some sort of light tan color, at least in our region. In some areas it's gray. It just depends on what the local material is. And it's almost like, if you're not familiar with it, like halfway between a sandy soil and a gravel. In pathway areas, it's mixed with what's called a binder, which is something that when it's wet and compacted, kind of forms a semi-paving. But in landscape areas, it's just put on without the binder, and to really continue to be completely permeable to water when it rains or if there's overhead irrigation. And then eventually it will compact a little bit down, but this is kind of what it's going to look like in a home garden over time. So some notes on decomposed granite if you are considering it. So we talked about without stabilizers. If you're doing a pathway or patio, you're going to do it with the stabilizer and compact it and learn how to do that. Decomposed granite should only be used on relatively level areas because it will, in the rain, erode and run off because it's that kind of fine, semi-soil almost. And it will cause a total mess if it's covering sloped areas and it rains. Best, if you are thinking about using it for walkways or patios, best to not necessarily have that right next to the house because the little particles can get tracked in on shoes, or dog paws is definitely something that I hear a lot. And so if you want to use it in your yard somewhere, it's best near the house to have some sort of walk-off area. So if you have a concrete patio or an area of pavers or a gravel patio or something like that, where the shoes or paws walking over it will then just naturally kind of lose most of that before tracking it to the house. And even if it's put in with the binder, once it's wet, any sort of decomposed granite will become pretty muddy. And so it's best to wait until it dries some to walk on it. So you're not kind of making a whole mess all over the place. And then the final thing is that weeds do love to germinate, and it's almost like a very sandy soil. So weeds do love to germinate in decomposed granite can be an issue. So it can be appropriate for plants that grow in naturally lean soils like decomposed granite soil. A lot of the lower San Gabriel Mountains right above our communities in Southern California, or the lower San Bernardino Mountains, that soil is basically decomposed granite. And so if we're planting California native plants or succulents in our gardens, this is very appropriate as a cover for our soil and accomplishes that soil cover of mulch, has a nice look and can be appropriate for those plants, but it's the same thing. It's going to be those drier adapted plants, Mediterranean climate plants, just fine, but not for plants that want kind of lusher soil conditions. And then I mentioned mixing in cobble or boulders, and this is something that can be done with any mulch type to achieve kind of a more natural look, whether it's mixing it in with wood chip mulch, which is generally my approach at home. Is I often, because the price is right, when I plant a garden, even if it's a native garden, we'll put down 2 inches-ish of wood chip mulch just that first time. And in addition to the kind of creating my own mulch over time, I'll also add in some boulders, a little bit of gravel here or there, just to kind of mix to get a sort of more natural look. In general, when you're buying cobble or boulders, you pay by the pound and call around, because even for like our local river rock, at certain times, I've found a huge difference in terms of the price that different landscape materials yards are charging for pretty much the same project. And if you're getting cobbles and mulches and things like that, if you don't need to buy them all from one place, definitely call around and ask about each project, because sometimes one place will be more expensive on the stone, but cheaper on the gravel. And it can be a little bit all over the place, just for whatever reason. I'm not sure. And so here's some pictures of some beautifully gravel mulch gardens where you can see why someone might consider wanting to use gravel mulch in a garden. So a few pictures from a landscape architecture company called Terremoto. And you can see one of the lovely things in kind of dryland type gardens is that the small mulch, so this looks smaller than pea gravel. This might be that bird's eye gravel. The small gravel mulch can work on pathways and then sweep right into your planted areas, creating a beautiful, beautiful appearance. Really lovely effect. Here is a landscape that was designed by Ecotone Studios, and they're a local Southern California landscape company. And here you can see they actually replaced a long driveway. Usually when gravel mulch goes down in a driveway, there's actually a little structural plastic grid underneath that gets filled with gravel and topped off, so you can't see it anymore, but it can support the weight of the cars. But you can see here, the driveway then just kind of blends right into the edge of the garden by using that gravel mulch material. And here you can see kind of a combination of things. So we have our wood chip mulch, we have our boulders and our rock, and in our dry stream bed, then we're using cobble, and then there's some gravel mixed in as well. Another Ecotone Studios project. To me, this is a beautiful mix of wood chip mulch and stone. This is a landscape that was designed by Tim Becker, who's the director of horticulture at the Theodore Payne Foundation for California Native Plants. And this property was on their annual garden tour one year. And so you can see here, get started with wood chip mulch, but you can see now there's leaves, there's little twigs in there, and then there's even some branches, natural effect, and then the small boulders and the rock. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous naturalistic look. And so we're going to now talk about how to know how much mulch you need. We'll talk a little bit about costs, and then I think we'll have time to answer some questions pretty soon before we will wrap up the mulch and get into talking about compost. So how much mulch are you going to need? Easiest thing to do is use the internet. If you go to any search engine and type in mulch calculator, it'll bring up a couple of different things. The one that I find myself using most often is from a landscape calculator website. It's just this free little thing. And you could put down your area in square feet that you're going to have. So just your rough measurement. your depth in inches, and then it just does the quick math to tell you how many cubic yards of mulch you're going to need, which is normally how it's ordered in yards. And if you happen to be buying bags, then the number of 2 cubic foot or 3 cubic foot bags. And so you can see for what would be like a medium sized in our area front yard, for example, 1,000 square feet, if you are going to do 3 inches of mulch, for example, that's slightly over 9 cubic yards of mulch. And so for me, that would be 9 pickup truck loads of it. So might be worth thinking about getting it delivered. But you can see here, part of why I recommend that you work with it in bulk, however you're going to get it, is because that's like going to be 125 2 cubic foot bags of the stuff to get that much. It's going to add up quickly. So when you're thinking about the cost of a bag of mulch, it's pretty cheap sometimes at the hardware store, but that one bag of mulch does not go far at all. And so here's some cost comparisons. If we were talking about 1,000 square feet, three inches deep, and that is in general for native plants, I'll often go just 2 inches deep. If you're doing the turf replacement rebate, for those of you who might be thinking about it, the requirement is 3 inches deep on the mulch. But if it's like fruit trees or anything like that, I'm going at least 3 inches deep with the wood chip mulch. And so this is just what I used to do this calculation, and partially because I was also thinking about the local rebate requirements for turf replacement, which require 3 inches. And so you're going to need 9¼ square yards, but most landscape material yards are only going to sell in half-yard scoops. They do full scoops from their tractor, which are usually half a yard when purchased in bulk. Depending on how your property is set up, you may or may not have a good space to have extra material. In general, I try to guide people to not have extra material because most people don't have a big extra space to store extra mulch. And so oftentimes what I do find is when I use that landscape calculator, I would end up over ordering just a little bit, just so that if it's something where, 9¼ yards, I feel comfortable to round down. If it was 9¾ yards, I probably would not round down. So we're going to round down to 9 yards for here. Remember that these costs don't include delivery, which is also going to be potentially more expensive for some gravels, depending on the size of the truck, because you can run into weight limit as well and might need more deliveries. So at the time that I put this together last year, wood chip mulch to cover that 1,000 square foot area, 3 inches deep, was going for $26 a yard. $234 total cost plus delivery, which would have been $80 to get 9 yards of that wood chip mulch. The kind of cheaper local gravels, depending on the size and the options, $48 to $72 a yard. You can see the total cost. The more exotic gravels, which again, I don't think necessarily look any better, way more expensive. And then decomposed granite, somewhat in between. So that's kind of roughly what you would be comparing for cost. And so the last thing we're going to talk about is just some guidance for mulch in terms of how to select the right mulch type for the garden that you have. And ultimately, it's best to base it on the conditions that are going to match the natural conditions that will make your plants happy. So if based on that, you also have multiple options, and we'll talk about those plants that can take different options, then you could further decide based on the look, the cost, maintenance considerations. And like we saw in some of those pictures, feel free to mix in different areas or mix mulches together. So here are some of our local ecosystem types that might guide us a little bit. So here in Southern California, we have oak woodlands, but you might have woodland situations, if you're coming from somewhere else, or also if you're in Southern California, you might be planting trees from other sorts of woodland situations or plants from other sorts of woodland situations. So for example, if you have a camellia at home or an azalea at home as well, that's going to be more of a woodland type of plant. Those plants are from Asia, but that's kind of what you're talking about. Most of our fruit trees, where they natively evolved, is in some sort of woodland situation. So for woodlands, you can see what happens. The trees drop their leaves, trees fall and break down and decompose in place, and it's a highly organic soil. So what we are mostly going to do is we're going to provide wood chip mulch for those situations. Most of our trees are native plants from woodland situations, our temperate climate plants, and our fruit trees. If we look at some other areas like our local chaparral, that's more of like a rock and decomposed granite situation. And chaparral is also pretty similar to like coastal sage scrub or the Mediterranean areas where like lavender, rosemary is a lot of that sort of stuff comes from. So there we might use gravel, we might use decomposed granite, or we can do that light layer of wood chips just to kind of be replaced with the plant material's own leaf droppings over time, which is also what happens in little pockets. The plants do drop their leaves and kind of hold on to them. One thing that is extremely important for using mulch is you never want your mulch, especially your wood chip mulch, to be touching the base of the trunk or the main stem of your plants. That can absolutely promote rot and disease, especially with wood chips in the wet time of year. They absorb a lot of water and hold on to it once the conditions are moist, and that can promote rot right up against your main stems or your trunks for a long period of time. So the general rule is you want to keep your mulch held back a minimum of 3 inches or more from the main trunk or stems of your plants. And over time, the mulch can migrate. So a garden maintenance task every once in a while is going in, and this is also true of like leaf droppings that will add up over time, is clean things back away from the trunk or main stem every so often, and check back maybe once a year or so, and kind of maintain things as necessary. It's definitely very important, especially if you're working with wood chip mulch with California native plants from dry areas. Over mulching too close to the trunk is something that does absolutely cause problems and is something that should be avoided. So you can use that wood chip mulch, but just definitely keep it away from the stems. So some general recommendations, just to kind of break it down and keep it super simple. For general Waterwise plantings, talking about Mediterranean plants, Australian plants, all that great stuff that people are growing more in Southern California these days. 2 to 3 inches of organic wood chip based mulch for general Waterwise planting is an easy default. A coarser blend, so for it to break down slowly if possible, so kind of a chunkier mulch is great. Or if you have like excessively drained, very rocky soil that drains water really quickly, a finer grind of mulch will break down a little bit quicker and add some organic matter. Or if you have a very heavy clay soil, like if anyone from Chino Hills is joining us and you have heavy soil that doesn't drain, a finer blend as that organic material slowly breaks down will potentially improve your infiltration qualities of your soil, which will make your plants happier. Using plants for native plants from sage scrub or chaparral areas. So thinking most of our common native shrubs we might grow in our landscapes, sages, ceanothus, manzanitas, things like that. Most common option is a light layer of organic wood chip mulch, like maybe 2 inches, ideally again, a coarser blend. And after that, letting those plants primarily self-mulch, and then integrating some mulch, gravel, or stone as desired. But you can also do decomposed granite or gravel mulch. Those plantings from woodland areas, 3 inches of organic mulch, as well as letting leaves self-mulch as well. And then if desired for effect, you can also integrate some gravel or stone here or there. For desert plants, 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches of gravel or decomposed granite, or just a light layer of organic wood chip mulch. But in general, that 2 to 3 inches of gravel or decomposed granite is going to be the best thing for your desert plants, most like their native situation. Integrate those different gravel sizes if possible for a nice natural look. And then also remember, make sure that you have plant density sufficient to keep the landscape from feeling hot or oppressive. Use desert trees. And remember to use some beautiful flowering desert shrubs. There's so many beautiful desert shrubs that flower in the summer, especially, that if you're into cactus and succulents, mix it up a little bit. And that'll also help with that feeling like there's too much gravel. And then fruit trees, 4 to 6 inches of wood chip mulch. Pretty simple. There's been studies done because the economics of growing fruit trees, and if you only have access to 2 or 3 inches, then that's way better than no mulch. But 4 inches kind of maximizes the benefits of mulch under and around fruit trees, and you can go up to 6 inches, but that's really just so it'll last longer and take longer to break down. You wouldn't normally want to go any thicker than that. Vegetable beds, normally I'll do an inch or so of compost as a mulch layer at the time of planting. We'll talk about much more about compost pretty soon. And then after my summer crops are established, so not like when my seeds are just coming up, but after the summer crops are kind of up and going, I will often also add an inch or so of wood chip mulch on top of that compost to help more with soil and water savings. Why personally in my gardens, I normally wait to add that wood chip mulch on is because in highly organic, very regularly irrigated soils, especially in Southern California, where everything else is going to be a little bit drier, and then our veggie gardens are where we are going to be watering the most, is that the organic matter that we're building from the compost, plus the wood chips, plus the irrigation, makes the soil in those areas very attractive for earwigs and sow bugs or roly-polies. And they will, even though they eat primarily decomposing organic matter, if there are tender young seedlings, they will absolutely go to town on them. In my garden, they will decimate seedlings, but they are really only around in my veggie beds after that wood chip goes down. So once my tomatoes are up, my zucchini is up, all that sort of stuff, we can add the wood chip mulch, but not when it's young and tender. So let's answer questions now. We'll go through the last of our mulch questions. We're about halfway through the time of the workshop. Then we'll take just a quick 5-minute break, and then we will transition to our compost sections. So let's see. Okay, from Lily, how do I handle the heavy leaf litter from the pepper tree, camphor tree, and olive tree? Does it change the pH level of the soil? It probably won't be changing the pH level of the soil. Pepper trees are, like walnut trees I mentioned, allelopathic, so they do put out chemical compounds, at least in the root area, that make it hard for many plants to compete with them. That's why you often don't see much growing underneath them, as well as the heavy leaf litter. I haven't heard anything about the actual like leaf litter from pepper trees. I don't really know. Camphor and olive trees, yeah, there is just a lot of leaf drop. If there's a beneficial way to use that, or at least some of it in your landscape, I would say, definitely go for it. I would not remove the leaf litter down to where it's just bare dirt underneath those trees for sure, because they do like some of their own leaf litter or minimum wood chip mulch. But yeah, sometimes it is just a little too much. And then if you can use it as mulch somewhere else, that's great. Or worst case scenario, you can put it in the green bin. With camphor leaves and olive, if it's mostly leaves and not a lot of like long stems, you can probably compost them as well if you're going to be doing composting. But I probably wouldn't do it with the pepper tree. That's just my instinct. I'm not sure about the allelopathy of the leaves themselves, so I don't want to guide you in the wrong direction. Okay, from Gordon's, we're solarizing to eradicate Bermuda grass. Will mulch and or compost be enough to revitalize for fall plantings? Most likely, yeah, it should be. I read a study about solarization on organic farms because when there's heavy weed problems or even sometimes soil disease problems, that is an organic option. And when the soil biology after solarization has been studied in those agricultural situations, they find that the beneficial microorganisms are much quicker to return than the pathogens, and it normally happens pretty naturally. So yeah, just probably mulching and composting in most cases should be fine. So from Nate, we did talk about the depths of mulches already. Talked about gravel and temperature. Okay. Let's see. Moving on. From Donna, what would be a good mulch between narrow spaces between homes where there may or may not have been paths to the backyard? Whatever is going to work best for you. If it's mostly a pathway, wood chip mulch is fine, but gravel often works well as well. In a side yard area, yeah, whatever is going to be best, or if there's plants nearby, whatever might support those plants the best as well. Probably not decomposed granite if it's a narrow side area, because oftentimes there's water falling off of roofs right into those areas, and that decomposed granite would erode and kind of get messy if there's a lot of water falling directly on it off of a roof, if that's part of the situation. There was a question with compost, if it's being used as a mulch, how deep should you plant it to prevent weeds? Compost will not prevent weeds as a mulch. If anything, it might just help the weeds grow more because it has lots of nutrients, and seeds love to germinate in compost. So that would not be an application of compost for mulches if you're trying to prevent weeds. See, from Dennis. Since shredded leaves decompose quickly, would non-shredded leaves be a better alternative, or does that type of mulch have other disadvantages? Yeah, if you have leaves and you're just trying to make the best use of them, I would not bother shredding the leaves and just use them as mulch just the way they are. And it depends on the particular leaf and the look, but in general, exactly. And that still won't last super long, but it will last longer. From Gina, what about using wood fines? By that, I'm assuming that you mean like sawdust. If that is the case, I generally wouldn't do it. It's not going to provide the benefits of mulch, and sawdust is so fine that it actually can pretty quickly result in some of that nutrient lockup concern that I talked about earlier. It's kind of ground up and ready to go for the microorganisms. Question about fertilizer versus compost. We'll talk about that in composting. Can mulch be used in pots? Absolutely. Mulch can be used in pots. Will definitely help in a hot area. Pots dry out quickly. So yes, mulch pots. And it can be, whatever kind of mulch is going to look best with your plants. Wood chip or gravel are both fine. I have 5 oak trees that shed acorns. They kill the grass underneath. What do you recommend? Oak trees in general hate to grow in lawn. What I recommend is prioritizing the oak trees because they are incredible, very important trees that provide shade and lots of habitat. And let the lawn die out or carefully remove the lawn directly underneath the oak trees and just allow that to be a mulched area, potentially with plantings underneath that are compatible with your oak trees. And you can find lists depending on where you are and what trees those are, what specific species of oak trees of compatible plants. Like here in Southern California, depending on the amount of sun, if you just want something simple and green, there are some low kind of ground cover shrubs that'll work much better and support the health of the tree much longer. Being on a lawn irrigation system as well is one of the main things that kills oak trees in urban areas. Too much water too often if you're in Southern California. Okay, and then last question before our break from Scarlett. Can we make our own mulch from tree cuttings? Is there an easy, most economic way of chipping and shredding them down to mulch size? Great question. So yeah, it depends. So when I'm doing a little bit of like shrub trimming, sometimes I'm just spending a little bit more time with my hand pruners and trimming things up, but that doesn't go very far if you're doing a major cleanup or if you're like doing even a light trimming on like an oak tree. So I have this same situation. I have a pretty large backyard and my partner and I have only lived there for a couple of years, but now we're getting to doing more like regular annual cleanup and pruning. And we're generating more stuff than I can really make use of, chopping it with my hand. And so I recently found out about kind of a newer generation of electric plug-in like grinders or chipper shredders that are not the high-powered gas ones that suck things in super quickly and are very dangerous. So I got one recently to try out, and I've only had it for a few weeks, so I can't fully recommend it yet. So far, I'm happy with it, but I got a plug-in one that's made by a company called Sunjo that costs a little less than $200. It can grind up to like 1.5 inch branches. And it does it kind of pretty slow but steady. But for the amount of stuff that I am creating in my yard, it's about matched up. Because it's less high powered, it also, like, things need to be dry. It doesn't grind through it as much as like a real commercial grinder, but it seems to be meeting my needs pretty well. It's not incredibly noisy. It's pretty noisy, but I have just like a set of noise canceling Bluetooth headphones, and I listen to audiobooks while I just kind of send things through. And I'm really happy with it. So when I teach this class a year from now, I'll probably hopefully be able to make a recommendation, but that's what I've been trying because I'm in the exact same situations. Okay, so with that, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we have lots to cover on the compost. So it's 10:39 now. We will start at 10:44. So yeah, grab a drink of water or whatever else, and we will start back up with our compost section.
Okay, everybody, we are back. We're going to get started with the second half of the workshop, focused on compost and composting. And so here's kind of how we're going to start. We don't need to compost every area of our garden. We don't need to apply compost to every area of our garden. For most of our landscapes, I highly recommend working with plants that are just naturally adapted to the location of where we are and the soils that we have. Even better if they're plants native to our areas. In Southern California, we have so many awesome native plants that are just so beautiful, colorful, smell good, attract birds and pollinators and butterflies. And they're going to be adapted to whatever kind of soil we have, as long as you do some research. If you have super gravelly soils, there's plants that are going to work there. If you have heavy clay soils, there's plants that are going to work there. We don't need to do a lot of work if we select those plants well for those areas of our garden. But what happens when we want to grow fruit trees, vegetable beds, or if you do specifically, if you love roses and you want to have some beds of roses, well, then we probably need to improve our soil some, whether it's very heavily drained, gravelly, or super sandy soil where we want to add some more water holding capacity, or it's heavy clay soil where we want to increase infiltration capacity. And we also are going to be thinking about, for those kinds of plants, nutrients and other kind of really having a high biological activity in our soil to be cycling nutrients and protecting those plants, which are relatively disease prone from diseases. Well, it turns out that whatever soil you have, compost is actually normally the go-to solution, at least to start with, for most home gardeners. And thinking about composting at home, it's a great chance to turn basically what's a problem, food scraps, into a solution. Best magical soil improving stuff ever. And food scraps are actually a pretty significant problem. The problem is that when food scraps go into landfills and biodegrade in the anaerobic conditions in large landfills, they actually release a lot of methane. And methane is a super potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. And so even at the state level in California, starting next year, food scraps are going to have to be recaptured and composted in a number of different scales and programs. But we can do it at home and get awesome garden amendments, which, if composted well, are going to be more biologically active and better for our landscapes usually than anything we can buy in a bag at a nursery. So we're going to talk about composting. So if we have rocky soil, heavy clay, this is going to be kind of our go-to. And you will never turn clay soil into loam soil by adding sand. What almost always happens when people try to do that is they make something closer to concrete, because you just can't add enough volume in a yard, even if you're doing a whole inch or 2 inches, to really make that difference. You're never going to add a heavier soil type to very sandy soil and make beautiful loam. What you can add is organic matter in the form of compost and help both of them along the way. And compost is really powerful for our gardens for two major reasons. One is it's adding organic matter to our gardens. And the other one is that it is adding, if it's produced well, beneficial soil biology as well. And the soil biology needs the organic matter to thrive, so they are a little intertwined, but they both are contributing factors in different ways. So what is compost? Here is a close-up of some compost from one of my home compost piles on the right. Compost is defined really as fully decomposed organic matter. Usually it originates from a mixture of woody material and a heavier nitrogen containing material. So woody material, it has a lot of carbon in it, and a heavier nitrogen containing material can be vegetables, can be some leaves, can be manures. In a home compost pile, generally you don't want that to be human, dog, cat manure, but like chicken, rabbit, things like that. And the combination of a organic carbon material and an organic heavy nitrogen material put together in the right ratios with moisture is going to create compost through the activity of biological organisms, mostly bacteria and fungi, during different stages of the composting process. And you don't need to add them. They are everywhere in the world. And compost is loaded with life. It's literally created by life, and good compost, once it's created, as long as it's not dried out or desiccated, is going to be loaded with the stuff. So why do we want compost? Compost is a great soil amendment for plants that like those richer soil conditions, specifically vegetables, fruit trees, roses, turf, even many subtropical trees. It helps build soil for tricky soils like heavy clay or excessively gravelly soils. And by building soils, I mean soil structure, and we'll talk more about that. The soil structure benefits and the chemical properties of compost help the amended soil hold nutrients and hold water better. Compost can help reactivate beneficial soil life and the soil food web in kind of impacted soils or neglected soils. And it can help turn waste into a resource that also actively helps sequester carbon in the soil. So there's a few general types of compost that we'll explore before we get into our homemade compost kind of systems. And there's a few reasons to explore that. Homemade compost produced well is generally going to be the best stuff. However, depending on how large of a garden you have and how much produce comes through your kitchen, how many kitchen scraps you have, whether or not you have access to manures or your carbon materials. For most people who are avid vegetable gardeners and grow a lot of fruit trees, you might make compost, but even if you're pretty into it, oftentimes, especially in the first number of years of establishing a garden, you might want more compost on an annual basis than you could actually make at home. So that's definitely the case for me. I make compost, I use all the compost that I make, but I'm still bringing in a little bit of other compost every year, and we'll probably do that for at least a few more years. So homemade compost is usually the best if it's well made, but you might need more. Mass-produced compost purchased in bags. And so that's like what stuff you can get at the big box hardware store or most nurseries. Honestly, usually if you look at it, it's not fully broken down organic matter. It might be partially broken down, but there's still a lot of you can see it's shredded little twigs and sticks and other things like that. And oftentimes there's additional nutrients added to it. So it's not like mulch, how I warned, don't mix mulch into the soil. There's the nutrients there, but it's not fully broken down. They're just producing so much of it and moving it so quickly that I honestly wouldn't consider most of it to be truly compost. But it still might act as a soil amendment, depending on what it is. It still might help in your situation if you need to get a lot of organic matter, because it is still organic matter and nutrients into your soil. It's just not that fully broken down great compost. Those are those bag products, at least the stuff that I know of available where I am in Southern California. Mass-produced bulk compost from landscape materials yards, like the same places where you would buy your mulch. In Southern California, I've also never found what I would call true compost, that true fully broken down. What is sometimes sold as compost helps as a soil amendment in many cases, but it often has chunks of unbroken down, like horse manure is common. You definitely want to look at it at the yard or get a sample before ordering. Sometimes I've had stuff that's really unbroken down that I've been unhappy with. Sometimes it's been stuff that I don't consider fully compost, but I'm more than willing to use as a soil amendment. And then the final one of things that are available near us in Southern California are mass-produced compost with biosolids. And so usually these come from the biosolids themselves are highly treated so that there's no pathogen issues anymore. Highly treated the solids that come from regional water reclamation plants. So it's the solids from the sewer system. And they go through highly regulated processes. They're mixed with the carbon kind of green materials, usually from like green waste programs. And they create what is a broken down compost product. The quality varies depending on where it's produced and the production quality. Our locally produced material, which is made by the Inland Empire Regional Composting Authority in a location in Rancho Cucamonga,
has worked well for me in my experience and is what we give away at our compost giveaway program. So it is produced with the biosolids. And basically, there's an ick factor with some people. But if you can get beyond that, essentially, this stuff is being created in our communities. And if we're not doing something beneficial with it in our communities, the only other solution is to basically truck it out to a dump somewhere far outside of our communities, which is not an environmentally friendly way of dealing with it. And so this compost is something that that needs to be used. And I personally am currently using it on my vegetables and fruit trees. Before I was comfortable using it on my vegetables, I used to just use it on my fruit trees. But yeah, that's just what the deal is with compost produced using biosolids. In some cases, there have been, I know anecdotally, I've heard from people living in other areas, not from people getting the compost produced in my area, of like heavy metal contamination and other issues with biosolid compost because of stuff that can accumulate in the sewage plants. I know at least in our local area, they do test the material, not every single batch, I believe, but on a semi-regular basis as kind of quality control. So I've become comfortable using it. And when I do need to bring in additional compost into my yard, that is what I use, is the stuff that we give away in our compost giveaway program. So these are the things which are sometimes sold as like compost. Some of them will have the word compost on it, but if you look at them, they're not quite broken down. But they might be helpful as soil amendments. In a bagged product that you can get at a nursery, this happens to be the closest thing that I found to compost in a bagged product, and I have used on some projects. It can be quite expensive, but if I'm just trying to get like a raised bed going for the first time and I don't have access to homemade compost, this does have some great ingredients in it, and it is pretty well broken down, pretty close to compost. And when I sift my compost, I still have little sticks and things like that in it. So that's one particular option. But if you have like a huge vegetable garden, it's probably going to be cost prohibitive to bring in lots of this stuff. Plus, it would be like lots of bags. And to me, this is an example of the real stuff. And so you can see, usually with a home compost pile, there's still going to be some sticks and other things like that in it, depending on what you're using for your carbon material. You sift it generally, depending on how you're going to use it, especially you sift it if you're going to mix it into the soil, and that gets rid of most of the things. And then a few little sticks or pieces of mulch might come through. When there's really like so little of it like this, it's okay if it gets mixed into the soil. And all of this other stuff you see here, that's the fully broken down compost. For fully broken down compost, you should not be able to identify like what the parent ingredients were at all. So on the biological level, why is it important to have an active soil food web, and how does adding the compost help out? Well, when you add the compost, one, there's just kind of food. The organic matter that you're adding to the soil is food for a variety of microorganisms. Then other different microorganisms eat other microorganisms, and that's why it's called a food web. It's this whole kind of chain of things going on. And that chain of things going on and all the animals eating each other, little microorganisms have a number of beneficial effects. So here's a picture that I really like that was created by a scanning electron microscope. And what you see here is this thread with these little rings is a fungus. This is a fungal thread. So the vast majority of fungus that lives in the soil, and fungus is critical to the soil, are not things that are going to harm our plants. The vast majority of them are neutral to beneficial. This is a particular fungus that has these rings that exude a compound that attract nematodes, which there are, again, many varieties of nematodes. The vast majority of them are not a problem for any of our plants, but some of them are. This one happens to be a nematode that causes problems for our plants. And it attracts it into these loops that it has. And once it is in there, it's like a trap. And then all of a sudden they can inflate these cells very quickly. They trap it, they break it down. Essentially, this fungus specializes in eating nematodes during a certain part of its life cycle. So that's less nematodes to have affecting our plants for those pathogenic nematodes. And so even though this fungus doesn't directly benefit our plants, having this whole competitive system keeps everything a little bit more balanced. And so by having organic matter content in our soil, in our vegetable bed and fruit tree areas, especially for our veggies, because they tend to be more disease prone than like most of our landscape plants, we create this competitive environment where it's less likely that any one particular organism that causes an issue for our plants is likely to totally get out of control in the soil. It's not an absolute cure-all. It's not like you're going to put down compost and all of a sudden all of your soil problems, if you have soil problems in your vegetable garden, are going to be solved. But it is definitely something that can help provide part of the context for a solution. And so when we talk about soil structure, this is basically like an enlarged diagram of what well-structured soil looks like. And so in well-structured soil, whether it's clay soil or sandy soil, there's a crumb to it. And when you look at it close, even with the naked eye, you can see that there's the stuff of soil, and then there's little bits of open space in between. And those little bits of open space in between is where all of that life is happening. So in good agricultural soil, in any amount of volume, only 50 to 60 something percent of that volume is going to be actual soil. Everything else are the little air spaces in between, which are homes for water when things get watered and then they drain out. And then it's a place for air because roots need air as well. And then within those spaces, all of that biological activity is happening. What happens like after heavy equipment is on soil or construction projects is that all gets compressed, and you might have soil that's like 85% the actual stuff. And sometimes it's called compaction, 85% compaction, 90% compaction. And then, so think about this soil structure you see on the screen, the homes for all of these biological organisms. You can see the fungal threads here, and fungal threads are actually pretty sensitive, fragile little structures. And all of a sudden that's compressed down. And obviously that creates a situation where the stuff of life is not really there in the same way anymore. And it creates all of these little microhabitats for all of this little stuff going on. And what happens with all of that is this complex soil food web. And you do not need to understand all of these different things. But what the takeaway is in addition to bacteria, in addition to fungus, in addition to tiny little mites and nematodes and all sorts of things, is that they're all eating each other. And in fact, natural plant available nutrients, whether it's in a natural soil system or with organic fertilizers, are only available directly to our trees and our plants in the form that they can use those nutrients, especially nitrogen, once it's kind of gone through a bunch of this system. So when we put down our organic fertilizer, it's not like you wet it, it goes into the soil and the plant uses it. It's actually being consumed by soil microorganisms. And as they excrete or die, that form of nitrogen is available to the plants. And so we need all of this going on in order to have that. What happens with some of the chemical fertilizers is they're directly available to the plant right away, but they create soil conditions where the microbes can't necessarily thrive. And then the only way to provide, until you work on getting back to an organic system, the nutrients to the plants is more and more chemical fertilizer, which has other disadvantages. And it's really easy to over fertilize or damage your plants with them. That can cause too much salt buildup in the soil, where with the organic system, it's all kind of just a gentle, everything's kind of happening all the time. So how do we actually use compost in our soil? Kind of top recommendations. Here are the practices that I most believe in. This is not the only way to garden. This is how I have settled on gardening, and I teach gardening because it's what I find works for most people I've worked with in most situations. So if this is not how you use compost and you like to use it differently and it's working for you, then I'm not telling you that you're wrong, but this is my general recommendation. For compost, the first season when I'm setting up new vegetable beds or doing like a big renovation to neglected vegetable bed soil, I will lay down at least 1 inch up to 4 inches of compost if I can get a hold of it on the top of the soil, and then mix it in with a digging spade or a shovel evenly down to 1 foot deep, so that it's being mixed through the whole top foot of the soil. And that is flipping apart that whole soil food web. That's breaking up a lot of that fungus. So that is disturbance. But that first season, I want to get that organic matter nicely distributed through that top foot of soil. After that first season, I am careful not to walk on my vegetable soil to avoid compaction. That mixing everything up to that 1 foot also loosens the soil. Then I'm only standing on the pathways when I'm doing all of my vegetable bed work and harvesting. And in between seasons, and if I can, I will do this twice a year in Southern California, right around when I'm planting my spring crop and right around when I'm planting my main fall crop, I will what's called top dress with my compost. And with my fruit trees, if I have enough compost, I'll do it once a year. If not, I'll do it just whenever I can get enough. And certain garden perennials, which I'm not currently growing, but kind of like classic garden flowering perennials or roses as well. Once a year, if you can do it, is really nice. If not, when you can. And so when I top dress with compost, I'll add about 1 inch of compost. Less is better than nothing. My vegetable beds, I really do try to be able to add 1 inch of compost at least once a year. Just lay it out on the top, and then over basically as a mulch layer, and then over time, kind of earthworms and other critters and things like that, just kind of slowly mix it in. I'm not disturbing the soil anymore because I'm respecting that soil food web, the microorganisms being where they want to be, that building the soil structure. And I don't want to disturb it anymore after that first season where I do the major renovation. And then what I generally will do is, maybe I want add compost to every fruit tree in my yard every year if I don't have enough, but, I'll kind of rotate around and add it when I have it. If you are producing a, quite small amount of compost in your home garden to a quite large garden, which is a situation that I've been in sometimes, I'll kind of consider my homemade compost, which I know has good biological activity, as kind of like a precious, almost like a probiotic for the soil. So I might have organic matter that I've brought in to do my top dressing, but then I will just take like a handful here or a handful there of my homemade compost that I know has that great biological activity, and just kind of lightly dig it into the soil or tuck it underneath the other stuff I brought in all around, as kind of like a way to keep inoculating the soil in different areas with that precious homemade stuff that I have. You can also use compost to improve drainage, like I mentioned, and improve soil structure in heavy clay soils. For a general landscape area, the first time you do it during a renovation, you might actually lay out a couple inches of compost and mix it into the soil, or you can just leave it on the top. Like if you're doing a 1,000 square foot garden, you can just leave it on the top. It'll work its way in there eventually. And the exact same thing to improve water holding capacity in very fast draining soils as well, in general landscape situations. And so match your strategy to your compost best use and how much of it you have. And so how is compost made? Essentially, compost is just the natural aerobic decomposition of organic matter into humus, which is basically not quite soil, fully broken down, fully composted organic matter. And aerobic means with oxygen, which is absolutely critical. Good homemade compost happens in the presence of oxygen. If you've ever smelled like a stinky compost pile, that's almost always a situation where there's not enough air and a different set of bacteria starts breaking things down and off gases some nasty stuff. It also can create some nasty stuff within the soil, can promote the growth of pathogens. So we want to keep things aerobic, and we'll talk about how to do that. When you think about just the natural decomposition of organic matter, if you just tossed a banana peel out into your yard, it's going to break down eventually. It might also attract, critters that you don't want. But why do we actually then compost if all the stuff that goes into compost will eventually break down anyways? Well, it ensures a nice final product as a soil amendment for our yard. It makes sure that it's not going to smell bad as it goes.
It'll make it far less attractive to critters than if we're just throwing our kitchen waste out into our yard. And it can also make it all happen in a relatively compact space compared to just like laying it out in the yard. That's part of why we compost. And so what I am going to do is quickly answer some. I'll take a look at questions. Okay, I think these can all hold until we get a little bit farther. Okay, so let's keep going for now. And this is critical. This is one of the biggest ideas, and where what I'm going to teach you might be a little bit different than what you've read about composting before, or a lot of the stuff about compost on the internet. We're going to talk about hot versus cool compost. Most likely, most of what you've read is about what's called hot composting, which is you add the compost ingredients together. Your compost pile gets super hot. It cooks things down really quickly. Oftentimes, you're talking about turning the compost pile on a regular basis, maybe taking temperature readings of your compost pile, all that sort of stuff. It's a lot of work. And what I have found is that for those of us living in urban and suburban areas, we're not on a small farm, we're not on a large farm. It's almost impossible to consistently do hot composting well, casually at the home scale. And what I mean by casually is that I know people who composting is their hobby. Sometimes there are people where like gardening is their hobby and composting is also their hobby. I've known some people where like gardening is something just to do with their compost and they really love composting. And that's kind of what it takes, is composting being an additional hobby in addition to gardening to be successful with hot composting in an urban or suburban area where you don't necessarily have tons and tons of material at your disposal all the time, because you're going to be finding material, you're going to be scheduling out, you're going to be stockpiling material, you're going to be scheduling out when you build your compost pile, and then paying a lot of attention to it and needing to maintain it when it tells you it needs to be maintained, not at your leisure. Here's part of why. To build up the heat in hot composting, that heat is created by all the biological activity, primarily of the bacteria, right when you build that compost pile, and kind of continues on if there's enough food and oxygen for that bacteria to kind of keep things going at that very, very high level of activity. In order to do that, it pretty much requires at least a cubic yard of material of the right ratios being built into a compost pile all at once. That's kind of the smallest threshold. So remember, a cubic yard is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. However, and that doesn't sound that much abstractly, but remember, like that's what will fill the back of my Toyota Tacoma pickup truck bed. So that's kind of a lot if you're thinking about kitchen scraps and wood chips. And you need that all at once to mix together. You can't do it a little bit at a time and eventually hope to get to that much. You won't build up the heat. It requires putting it all together at once. And after you do that, that temperature will skyrocket if you have the right ratios of materials you'll put in, and we'll talk about those. But you don't want it to get too hot. You want it to get to slightly over 140 degrees, but not up to 160 degrees. After that, it requires to do it well. Careful temperature monitoring to make sure that it is staying above 140 degrees. And then if it drops down, you are needing to turn it, like mix up the whole compost pile to get more air into it to supercharge that bacteria again. Or if you do that and it still doesn't go back up, that means that you don't have enough high nitrogen material and you need to supplement it and turn it again. And it requires that pretty careful balance of materials in terms of the carbon stuff and the nitrogen stuff to reach that sufficient heat. And sometimes with just the stuff that we are accumulating at home, we have our kitchen scraps, which have nitrogen, but if we don't have any manures or we're not bringing in supplemental high nitrogen stuff that we're buying in, we might not have that correct balance to get up to that full 140 degrees for that hot composting. So that sounds like a lot of work.
if you can do it, if compost is going to be your hobby and you're up for that, that is the best way to make compost quickly, because at that high temperature, the compost process does happen a lot faster. And at that temperature, if held for multiple days over 140 degrees, it will be hot enough to kill weed seeds that are exposed to those high temperatures for long enough, and it will kill the majority of soil pathogens. So even if you happen to put material into your compost pile that has like some disease organisms on it, some soil pathogens, which is not something I'd ever recommend doing intentionally, but it is that extra safety. However, also remember that all relies on the rotating. So if a bit of your compost pile has some weed seeds, and for some reason, as you do your mixing up your soil, it stays kind of towards the outside of the pile and is never at that high heat right in the middle, then that won't really reach that threshold. So if you do everything really well, that's awesome, and you will have the quickest producing, highest quality product. However, the vast majority of people that I know who have tried that don't consistently get good results in hot composting. If there is anyone in this audience right now that does get consistently good results from hot composting and lives on an urban or suburban yard, kind of smaller yard, definitely type into the chat, and I might put you on the spot to tell us a little bit about your technique. Also, if there are people who have been trying to do this and have been unsuccessful, that'd be useful to type into the chat as well. I often hear that from people, but I'm kind of always trying to gather more information about my assumptions. I know for myself, done lots of training in composting. I've seen compost piles large and small. I feel very familiar with the techniques and what it requires to be successful. I love gardening, spend a lot of time on garden projects. And I know that I feel like the time and the willingness to gather all those materials and be taking temperature readings every day and consistently turning my compost piles to create what I feel like would be a successful hot composting system at home. So I do cool composting, and we'll talk about worm composting later. But with cool composting, I will say that my compost pile is often pretty much a big worm bin. Anyways, so I've stopped doing separate worm composting. Used to. So cool compost. What is cool compost? Well, I feel like cool compost is going to be what works best for most of us who don't want to treat our compost piles like another pet or a part-time job. With cool composting, we're not trying to accumulate those hot temperatures. And so we can be a lot more flexible. We can add materials to our compost bin just a little bit at a time. We still want to have that right carbon nitrogen ingredient balance. That's still very important, but it is a bit more forgiving because we're not trying to reach any specific temperature threshold. You never need to turn the whole pile, just a little bit of mixing when you are adding new materials in just at the top. And even that can be optional, though I do recommend it. And so you're just kind of building it up and adding a little bit more and mixing it some and continuing to build it up. In many cases, this is what happened to me, built my compost pile, a very dry, neglected corner of my yard. And just after having the compost pile there for a while and watering it, keeping it nice and evenly moist, doing the things I do, which I will lay out to you the whole system later, it attracts the worms. Worms come there. I never had to add worms to it. Maybe from my worm bin, some worms ended up into it, but sometimes they just seem to attract the worms. And if you keep the conditions good for them, they won't be evenly there all year round, but they will be there quite a bit. And sometimes it'll be like a huge worm bin. And that breakdown also helps quite a bit. Really high quality part of the composting system. But even if they don't show up, the system still happens. Drawbacks is that it doesn't kill weed seeds and pathogens. So if I'm pulling weeds, they go in the green bin. If I have like my yard, just the yard I inherited, I get good production on my tomatoes, but we definitely have like diseases for tomatoes present. When those tomato plants get pulled at the end of the season, I don't compost those leave the property. And so
that's kind of one of the drawbacks, is that you need to be a little bit more selective with what goes in, and you want to avoid weed seeds and definitely avoid pathogens. And it also does take longer to create the compost than with a hot system. But like my system, for example, is I have 2 compost bins because I still do a lot of composting, and we cook a lot in my kitchen and have a lot of stuff coming out of our garden. So a lot of kind of inputs in terms of veggie scraps and, outer leaves that we've cleaned off. And so I keep 2 compost bins in this area, and I time it so that I normally still am able to clean one of those out, sift, and have my compost once for my fall planting and once for my spring planting. So the schedule, works very well for me. Whichever kind of approach you are taking for your inputs of compost, it's about a balance of what are called green material and brown material. So green is kind of the equivalent of nitrogen, browns are your carbons. Good quality compost and good smelling compost, very important, especially for composting in urban areas and not huge yards, is a balance of high nitrogen and high carbon materials. So the common high nitrogen inputs are vegetable scraps, lawn trimmings, farm animal manures, so again, not dog or cat or human, and green leaves. And they can contain different amounts of nitrogen, like lawn trimmings and animal manures have a lot more nitrogen, vegetable scraps and green leaves less, but those are going to be the nitrogen inputs. For people who are super into compost, they get into things like looking up the nitrogen ratios in each of these and kind of really, they have like recipes for their compost piles. Cool composting, you don't need to get into all of that. Common carbon inputs, wood chips and arborist trimmings and straw, but not hay, are kind of the most common ones. And I don't find straw honestly ideal. I would never, I've composted with straw quite a bit. I would actually never go out of my way to get it or pay for it. I use wood chips, arborist trimmings. Basically, my compost into my compost system, or my carbon input into my compost system, is exclusively the mulch that we give away for free at the Waterwise Community Center. It works really great as the carbon part. And to keep it simple for cool composting, for most of us, we can aim for about 50% by volume, high carbon ingredients to high nitrogen ingredients. If you're using a lot of like farm animal manures, you would probably have proportionally a little bit more on the high carbon, like wood chip side, a little bit less on the nitrogen. But for most of us in urban areas, we're using primarily our vegetable scraps and maybe some lawn trimmings into our compost for our nitrogen. And that's a little bit less potent. So that's what I do. And when I do it, I'll show you, I measure it out. I use 5-gallon buckets, 50%. So I'll do like 3 buckets of my wood chip mulch, 3 buckets of vegetable scraps. Other things about what to avoid or what you can add. Avoid meat, oil, and generally dairy. So like if I'm cleaning a plate, a tiny little bit of cheese gets into the compost, I'm not worried about it. But meat and oil, definitely avoid. And you don't want too much dairy. All of those things will also potentially attract more critters, and they're generally a big industrial compost pile. You can absolutely compost them, but not what we want to be trying to do in our home compost piles. If you have chickens or rabbits, their poop is definitely good, high nitrogen, or the bedding for chicken or rabbits. But yeah, not human, cat, or dog poop. So see about questions that have come in. Okay, some questions that have come in. Can you use brown cardboard boxes for brown material? You absolutely can use brown cardboard boxes, but you're going to have to tear them up pretty small for to kind of mix into your compost pile. So I will do that occasionally. I'll just like have a couple of boxes near my compost pile and tear them up some. And actually the glues that are creating the corrugations in those in that cardboard are actually really loved by earthworms as well. And it creates that aeration that we like. All those corrugations in the compost pile in the cardboard creates these nice little aerated pockets. So it's good stuff, but it can be a lot of work to rip up because you wouldn't just want to put a whole compost or a whole cardboard box in them. Are eggshells okay in compost? Absolutely. What I do is you'll see the little compost pail that I keep on my kitchen counter. I do use eggshells. They are a great source of calcium and they break down well. I give them a quick rinse out so that the kind of like film on the inside of them goes down the sink, because that is a little bit higher in nutrient and not really something that I think that might be attractive to critters. But I just give it a quick rinse. I don't like wash it out with a sponge, and then I use my eggshells definitely. Okay. Can you use rabbit directly as fertilizer without composting? I have heard that you can. I don't have experience with it. I will not recommend, I don't have experience with it. I generally will not recommend using any sort of raw manure directly on vegetable crops, but should not be a problem to use around the base of your fruit trees. Because even if there are any pathogen little issues, unless you're like picking it up off the ground, then like if you're picking your fruit from the tree, like those same pathogens can't like get up through the tree and into the fruit. So yeah, raw rabbit manure, I believe, I'd say double check, but I believe is fine to use on fruit trees. Chicken, definitely not. That's way higher. But it's always a good idea to compost it and could add a good little boost for your compost pile. Okay. I don't think eggshells in the compost will increase the pH. And generally to increase pH, you need, unless you're using like some like raw element like sulfur, you need a lot of the material. And most people, you know, by percentages, eggshells are going to be such a tiny percent. Okay. Let's see, mushroom compost, pros and cons. I actually don't have any direct experience with mushroom compost. I know some people who have used it. My kind of general feeling about it and what I have a sense of from other people who have used it is, you know, if it's available to you locally in your community, then sure, go for it. But like I have known people that like read about mushroom compost and they go way out of their way to try to get some, and, you know, driving for hours and things like that. And there's no soil amendment that generally, in my opinion, is going to be worth it, because we normally can produce perfectly good compost with what we have available to us and focus on that. And that's going to have a way smaller environmental impact on our garden than driving hours in a car to pick up some exotic ingredient, if that's the case. Some people live near where there's mushroom farms and they can get it. Okay, let's see. Are coffee grounds good in compost? Absolutely. Like lots of coffee grounds go into my compost. Shredded paper. You can use some shredded paper. Shredded paper is super high in carbon, and when it wets, it kind of mats down a lot. So structurally, because we want to keep that aerated situation, like if it was just vegetable scraps and shredded paper, once you wet it to provide the adequate moisture, I feel like there might not be enough like loft in the aeration. But having some shredded paper mixing in with your wood chips and stuff like that has something to do with it. That's just fine. Definitely not shiny paper. Some of the inks that are used in like full color shiny paper, and the shiny paper itself has like plastics in it, and some of those inks are not good. But normal like matte, you know, just black and white printed paper should be just fine. Composting old documents could be the new version of burning old documents. Okay, and last question, just because I do want to answer it, because I don't know if we're going to talk about it later, from Jen, who has found these weird black things in her compost, little insects, and has realized that they are black soldier fly larvae, and have been told that they're mostly beneficial insects. Is that true? Yeah, black soldier fly larvae, which also show up in worm bins, they're fine. I mean, they're just a fly, and they're not like going to cause a problem. And their larvae don't act that dissimilar to worms. They eat some of the breaking down organic matter, and they poop out what's called frass, it's just insect poop, which is great fertilizer. So yeah, they're just fine. In worm bins, sometimes they'll get so happy that the worms will be at a disadvantage, but in a compost pile, yeah, you'll see them. Most people will see them at some point in time, probably. Okay, so let's keep going for now. Some great questions. For those of you who have questions about like what compost bin or tumbler, whatever to use, we're about to talk about that right now. We're going to talk about compost piles and containers. And starting with the idea that the compost itself doesn't really care if it's in a container, for the most part. It's mostly for our convenience, because it's perfectly fine in terms of creating compost to have an open compost pile like this. However, in a typical suburban or urban backyard, that's maybe not what we want to see. From the outer scraps here that don't have any wood chip or carbon around them, as those just kind of start to rot on the outside, there's going to be some smells with that. There's going to be some flies, might be attracting possums or raccoons in the night. So if this is out on a farm, no problem. Not necessarily what most of us want in our backyards. I keep a pretty wild style backyard garden because that's what I like, but this still would be too much for me in my suburban backyard. So we're going to look at some different options. This is actually primarily what I go with. I generally don't like to endorse specific products, but I have two of these in my backyard. It's what I've settled on after using many different things. A few reasons. One, the price tag. Compost products for bins are crazy expensive. The price tends to be better on these than most things. And so these are about $39. I haven't found them in local stores. You can buy them pretty much anywhere online. And it ships as a tight roll, and it's just this material, and you can roll it out. So this is probably like half the full size this could be. And you make a loop, and then there's these little kind of buttons where it folds over that you put into these slashes, and it holds up pretty well. And so if you're going to have a smaller compost bin, you can do that. You can make it into a really big one. I mean, one of these gets bigger than I can make use of in my yard, with trying to have two of these and then kind of set them to finish up and harvest about every 6 months or so. So I keep mine a little bit wider than this, but plenty of capacity. And it has a good balance of keeping things together, but also allowing a lot of airflow. And so the California Cooperative Extension UC Master Gardeners has a really cool series of YouTube videos where they actually did a head-to-head compost bin system comparison. And so they took, I don't know, it was something like 5 different styles of commercially available compost bins, put all the same ingredients in, treated them the same way. And then at the end of a certain amount of time, they checked out the results, and I found out about this system because they found that this was the most effective one, happens to be the cheapest one as well. Because it is open in hot, dry Southern California, you do need to do a little bit more moisture management, like maybe re-adding water a little bit more often. But because it's open and has that airflow, it doesn't get too wet and tend to go towards anaerobic, which some of the more closed systems do. So this is kind of my go-to for a purchase system. You absolutely can use like a deer fencing available from the local hardware store to just basically make a big open loop to do something sort of like that. I have done that in the past. For quite a while, I had one of these, and I had another one that I made out of some leftover similar fencing like this after I had made some trellises, and I compared the two for a long time. What I found is that I think like this is so open that in Southern California, I feel like this gets very dry. I feel like there's a little bit less surface area on the sides open. With these, sometimes depending on the size of your vegetable scraps, you do get things that like fall through the open sides, where this tends to avoid that. And then the last thing is, if you do make these, if you have the material available, it's very inexpensive to do that. Not necessarily worth buying a whole roll, because then you're spending a whole lot. But the other thing to keep in mind is that, so you basically create the loop and then you fold some of the wire edge open to hold it in place. But those edges can be very sharp. So you definitely want to file them down. And I definitely know people who have sliced themselves pretty bad on this cut wire material. This is another, this or something similar to it is another kind of common compost pile approach. And these can work. This or similar design to it, like when cities used to have compost bin giveaways or discount compost bins, are usually pretty similar to this. And these can work for a passive compost system. Advantage is that they have like vents on the side, so there is airflow. It's easier to, in the summer, kind of keep your moisture in than the more open system. But if you accumulate a little too much moisture, it can go anaerobic and have all those problems I mentioned and start getting very stinky on the inside of these. Where on the more open system, if you like provide a little extra water, things tend to, with all this airflow, kind of even out. It's harder to swing towards it being anaerobic. One of the nice things about this style is that they usually have a hatch on the bottom. And so it's sometimes called like a pass through or a flow through design. And with our cool composting, if you're just going to have one pile where you're always adding to the top, the stuff on the bottom will be finished first and can be harvested out of the bottom in small amounts. And so if you're just going to have one, that is an advantage of this system. And I've known people who have this type and have been very successful with them. For hot composting, it's not that great because you can't really get in there to do all your turning. But with that cool compost, it can make sense for that kind of gradual, slow harvest. And then another obvious advantage is how contained it is. So if you're worried about, raccoons or possums or things like that, or even if like I don't happen to have rats in my area, in my backyard, so I'm not worried about the fact that mine is relatively open. But if you're in an area where I already know there's rats in the neighborhood, this approach, and then just being very careful not to add too much moisture, is a pretty good approach for a passive compost pile. And then this is, in terms of like the off-the-shelf systems, this is one of the last approaches that you will see, and they're compost tumblers. This is a relatively inexpensive one. I've seen these things going for like $300 or more, and different sizes. And honestly, I think these things are junk. I lived somewhere for a while that had one of these, and I tried all sorts of different things with it. And the problems that I had tended to be the problems that everyone who I've spoken with who tries to have a compost tumbler has had as well. So the reason why they market these things is the idea of like, you'll never have to turn your compost pile because you can there's a crank on the other side, or you can just push it and everything rolls together. But the problem is that to have a manageable weight for this style system, this thing is so small that they tend to either dry out very quickly, or they just don't have volume. Like this would fill up so quickly, and you definitely can't do hot compost. But even for my passive composting system, there's just not enough volume in this to make it worth it. And then sometimes they do get unstable over time and kind of start to fall apart. So if there is anyone in this audience today that has used this style of compost tumblers, then definitely let me know. I would love to hear a little bit about your experience. But yeah, I don't think these are a very good approach, to be honest. There's all sorts of other kind of fancier do-it-yourself or like designs or wood compost kits to purchase. Generally, they're mostly designed for hot compost in terms of like things like a 3-bin system. If you have a hot compost pile, can be cool, because what it is you're accumulating your materials, or you're building your compost pile in one, and then when you need to turn it, you're flipping it into the next one, and you flip it back and forth, and then there's a slot for one to continue to like cook down when you're done with it to finish. And then basically when that one is totally done, you flip that onto the final side, that becomes the cook down, and you do that back and forth. And so with a hot compost pile, if you have the room, that can be a cool design. For a cool compost pile, you just don't need to do that much work. And then another thing to mention is, from what I have seen, most of the wood compost kits that you would like buy online that are like cedar wood and
are supposed to last for a long time, are really do your research. A lot of those, they might be like a good cedar wood, but they're very thin and kind of flimsy because they'd be crazy expensive to build and ship otherwise. So usually even a good approach to like a 3-bin system is you're going to be building it with like hardware stored lumber, either creating your own plan or following a plan you found online, or also like I've used these where the bins are built with cinder blocks, and that's a very stable, steady approach as well. But again, way more work and takes up way more space than most of us will need for an urban or suburban area. So now I'm going to kind of show you the systems that I recommend for most of us, for people who don't want their compost pile to be a pet, but they want to compost and they want to make some good compost. So for me, this starts on my kitchen counter with our pail that we have here that all the kitchen scraps go into. Most of them are stainless steel. You can get plastic ones as well if you just have a small, whatever, some sort of container. But it is convenient to have this, especially if you cook a lot, right on the kitchen counter, and then empty it as you need to. The stainless steel one you can scrub out every once in a while, so I tend to like it. However, for some reason, all of the stainless steel compost pails that are sold, that I have found, or that are sold online that I've seen, they have these holes in the top, and then there's a little like black fabric, what they call it, like a carbon filter that's supposed to deal with smells. And that's just a bad design. I don't know if they do that so that you're supposed to keep buying those filters over time from the company and they make more money. But it's this kind of like porous fabric that, one, isn't needed, and two, when your compost bin is filled, you just get like food scrap gunk on them, and it gets super nasty super quickly. So maybe if you get one, you can find something else. But the one that we just put some packaging tape on the top of it, pointed up to kind of seal that off, because if it's just open, it will smell. But as long as it's just sealed, it doesn't smell at all. You should be emptying it out often enough that it's not going to really start smelling. And then we just like a couple times a year have to replace the packaging tape. And so here you can see it on the inside. And basically what we do is when that is full, we have a couple of 5-gallon buckets that are right out our back door from our kitchen. And then so it goes from there into the 5-gallon bucket. If you wanted to walk that all the way to your compost bin, you can. But just what works best for my life is we fill up a couple of 5-gallon buckets, and then not every week, but every week and a half to every 2 weeks, depending on how much we're accumulating. Then I dump those 5-gallon buckets. And things do start to kind of rot in those 5-gallon buckets and get a little ripe smelling. But that's just fine, because then they're going to be going into the aerated compost pile. If that kind of does not appeal to you, you can absolutely dump that. It's just whatever is going to be best to you. And so here is the compost bin, itself. I told you, it's wider. You see how wide it can get. And then there's these little buttons that hold it together. And it's always best to start your pile on top of just soil or wood chips. And so here, I have a large backyard, and this was just the neglected farthest back corner. And so that's where we put it. And so you can see when there's nothing in it, it does tend to be a little floppy, especially if you have it in the wider opening. But also what I will do sometimes, and what I currently have, is you can get a couple of, like if you go to the nursery, they have the narrow green little plant stakes, which aren't great as plant stakes, but they're these rigid kind of like fiberglass green narrow poles. And you can kind of slide one in on each side through some of these openings, and that keeps the thing much more upright. And so I like to start with a good wood chip layer underneath the bottom, good carbon layer, and that thick layer of wood chips, maybe 3 or 4 inches in the bottom, also helps keep a nice aerated layer on the bottom. So here's my older one. You can see here's a newer one that just got set up. So starting with that layer of wood chips, just kind of mixed trimmings. And then into that layer of wood chips, we put our kitchen scraps. And these days, normally what I will do is I'll accumulate 2 or 3 of these 5-gallon buckets and just do a little bit more work all at once. And so when you empty it, like for me, I always have, kind of coffee grounds, because there's a lot of coffee grounds in it. It's a little funky. So add it to the top of the wood chip layer. And then you're going to want to have some sort of digging fork or garden fork, some sort of tool, and mix that all in some, an occasional paper wrapper or something like that. Oh, that was actually a paper bag. Occasional paper bag goes in if it's not something that's a little too beat up to probably be recycled. And so mixing it in. And if you wanted to just layer it, you can, but having that carbon and nitrogen all mixed together is going to be really more beneficial in terms of the facilitating the quick breakdown. And then remember, because it's 50% vegetable scraps or nitrogen, 50% carbon, or for me, wood chips by volume, I just use whatever I just dumped in there as the volume indicator for whatever goes on top of these vegetable scraps. And so equal amount, I keep a small compost pile or keep a small wood chip pile nearby, equal amount, then goes in and tops that off. And that's also my smell filter. So the carbon as just an even layer on the top makes it less attractive to critters, and also keeps any kind of vegetable breakdown smells from going through the top. It basically acts like a carbon filter. One of the reasons why I like to accumulate a little bit more personally and then mix it in and then add to the top is that with at least 2 or even up to 3 5-gallon buckets, then I get to do a nice compost, mix it all in, nice mix, and then a nice pretty thick layer on the top when I add my next layer. And so you can see when that's done. And oftentimes what I will do is then add moisture. So normally what I will do is I'll add some, after this, I'll wash this out with my hose, and then I'll dump the water into the compost pile. And then I will do my final adding the wood chips to there, add that on top. I'll usually wet that down again, and then it'll be pretty clean. And then I don't mind leaving this because, again, that's just a little more carbon that's going to be in there. And then every once in a while, I will deeply scrub out everything. As the compost pile is built, you're going to want to check in on it every once in a while. And you're going to want to keep it a nice, even moisture. So moisture management in Southern California is quite important. And basically, you want your compost pile to maintain a moisture level, basically like a wrung out sponge. Like if you put your hand into it and squeezed it, which you would want to do with a gloved hand, you can get like just maybe 1 or 2 drops of water out. If you let it dry out, it'll stop composting, because when you let it dry out, the biological activity drops, but you don't need it to be like soaking wet. So basically for me, I'm in the summer adding at least once a week, I'm like hosing it down, poking around, checking in. And usually that's, when I'm adding my compost from my 5-gallon buckets, and maybe once in between. So here we're checking in on an almost finished compost pile. Basically what I do is I will get it up to a certain level, and then and it'll be amazing. You'll keep adding compost in and it'll look like it's almost full. And then a week later it will have dropped down because it's decomposing already. And so eventually, even though I have more space, I will stop, because I'll think I'm going to give this another 4 to 6 months to completely finish composting. Then I'll come back and do my main harvest, and then I'll start adding to my second one. So this is checking in on an almost finished compost pile. The top part, when you do your final layer of wood chips, is not going to break down, because that's just wood chips on the top kind of insulating it. And so that, when you eventually do harvest, can just get tossed into your new compost pile. And so kind of checking in, this is when the last kitchen scraps were added about 3 weeks ago. So you can see it's already, partially broken down. You can't see what vegetables they were, but there's still a lot of the kind of more carbon stuff and a lot of breaking down to do. If you smell your compost, which seemed normal to me until I put this slide together and presented it for the first time, it is a good indicator of what's going on with your compost. If your compost, when it's partially done like this, not right when you build it with your vegetable scraps, it'll smell a little funky if they've been sitting in a 5-gallon bucket. But if your compost, when it's in this stage and process, smells kind of like a nice humusy forest floor smell, that's good aerobic compost, what it should smell like. If it smells stinky and like the smell of rot, that is most likely going anaerobic, And normally the solution is you need a little bit more carbon. So mix in a little bit more wood chip, kind of, you don't need to necessarily turn the whole thing, but you might need to if it's gone very anaerobic. Mix that in and be careful with your water. And then you can see, it's not a worm bin, but there's worms in it. That's a very good thing. Some other critters that you will probably see if you are in Southern California, at least, are fig eater beetle grubs, which are huge, kind of scary looking white grubs. They look crazy, but they're harmless in compost. They turn into those big green beetles, which will go after figs or tomatoes in their adult form. But we leave them out because some of our local birds that hang out in our yard like to eat them. For them, if you have chickens or know someone with them, chickens go crazy for these little grubs. That's us leaving them out for our backyard birds. And so here you can see, here's an eggshell. Some things take a little bit longer to break down, a little scrap of paper. And this is just basically said, if it smells bad, then some more carbon, some more aeration should fix it. In terms of maintaining aeration, what I do is I have just a 2-foot piece of rebar that I got from the hardware store. And if things, are not fully anaerobic yet, but I check it and they seem that like they're a little on the wet side, especially. And then I do it just every once in a while, just because it's good to have aeration. You can take that piece of rebar, usually stick it pretty easily down into the pile and just sort of swirl it around. And it just kind of makes some extra air pockets. Someone did chat in on the chat that they have a compost aerator, which is like kind of a big metal corkscrew that you screw down and lift it up. I've tried one of those as well and thought that was a really cool thing until I was telling someone about it. And she was like, yeah, you just paid $40 for what I do with a piece of rebar. And after I tried it, I realized that the rebar does seem to work, at least in my compost pile with my mix of things, about as well. So it probably depends on your mix. But if you think that other product would be useful, that does exist. But always remember your kind of guiding light is about the same amount of moisture as a wrung out sponge. And you're going to want to dig down every once in a while and check deeper. Sometimes it takes a surprising amount of water to get your compost pile to that, especially if it's dried out a little bit. And that is one of our most common problems in Southern California in the summer is it will dry out on you if you don't stay up on adding the moisture. Always check in. Don't just keep watering and watering and watering. And then when you get to the final product, when you think you can see how much this has shrank down, how much it's broken down, how much kind of wall there is on the side of the bin. And when you check in underneath the mulch layer and it's finished, so you can see here, sometimes there's a little bit more in it when I'm done, but this was in this case. And this is, I will admit, you can see on the side, got a little bit drier than is ideal, but hey, it happens. This is not a pet. This is not my main hobby. Gardening is my hobby. Composting is part of that. And then if you are using it just as a top dressing on the top, I have gotten more and more tolerant of leaving little bits of, unbroken down wood chip mulch and not sifting as much over the past couple of years or so, because I'm putting compost on the top, and eventually later in the season, I'm even putting some wood chip on top of that. And so I realized, why am I even bothering sifting? And for the little fungus and stuff like that in there, not sifting would be better. If you are going to be mixing this into your soil, like you're starting to renovate a bed and there's more wood chip mulch and chunky stuff than you want, then you're going to want to sift it. You can look up plans for compost sifters on the internet, and there's ways you can use wood and some like hardware cloth, kind of that thick wire cloth to make sifters. The easiest thing that I have found is finding, leftover from local nursery trips or something like that. Or if you can somehow, just get a hold of, this is a nursery flat, like there would be the little 4-inch plants in it. And some of them have very wide openings on the bottom, but some of them have this kind of small pattern. And that's all I use as my compost sifter. Sometimes I'll put another nursery flat underneath at any pattern, as long as it's not going to block it. And so you can see this was still pretty chunky. And then you could just shake it over a wheelbarrow or a bucket. And there's quite a bit of wood chip in that one. That could go into the new compost pile. And that's what I was left with. So pretty nice looking stuff. And you can see all of that little structure. And this is true compost. You have no idea what the parent ingredient is, except for a couple of little sticks here and there. Because we are getting short on time, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep going, make sure I quickly cover worm composting, which is very simple the way I teach it. And then I will answer all of the questions down at the end, but plenty of time for questions. I can stay till after 12. So in a hot, dry area like Southern California, where do you locate your compost bin? If you can, in the shade. It will help retain moisture in the summer. Definitely in the shade. If all day shade is not possible, then try to place it in an area that at least gets afternoon shade. Best to be on top of bare soil or wood chip mulch, and within easy range of a hose because you're going to need to keep it watered. And also next to somewhere where you can easily store your carbon material. In my case, small pile of wood chips. If you have the space, 2 piles is ideal because you can let one pile finish while letting the other one, or while adding to the other one. But like I mentioned, if you only have room for 1 pile, then that's fine too. But it might be easiest to go with one of those bins that's kind of more structural and has that pass-through strategy where you can harvest the old stuff from the bottom. And so now we're going to spend a few minutes at the end on worm bins made simple. If you are interested in worm composting, a couple of things. One, like as you saw with my composting system, by default, in a lot of the year, I'm basically have a big worm compost bin anyways. And in the summer, the worms go a little bit lower. They're either lower in the compost, or if it dries out some, they'll go down into the soil. But then they can come right back up, and they will as soon as it gets a little bit cooler. And when I stopped worm composting is my partner and I had kept worms for many years. However, worms can die in soil temperatures over 85 degrees. And in fact, once you're just like a foot down or so, even a few inches down in soil, even in warm areas, the soil cools quite quickly. It's only hot at the very top. And so they can always just go farther down. In a worm bin, however, there's not that much buffer. And so in fact, we had a heat wave a couple of years ago now where it was like 110 degrees in our area. We did our best for our worm bin. We had it in the shadiest part of the yard, kind of the coolest little microclimate. We thought they'd be all right. And they actually died. Hopefully some of them escaped. And so we were very sad about that. But then I realized that our main compost bin had actually become kind of a worm bin. And so that's just what we do. We've already had some heat waves where it'd be very hard in our hot inland Southern California climate to keep the worms alive this year. And so if you are in inland Southern California, really make sure you have an area where not just like the shade underneath a tree, but where that soil is not going to get over 84, 85 degrees max, which might mean needing to take your worms inside your house, which is not as gross as most people think. A good worm bin should be pretty clean and self-contained. But then if you have pets, you might need to worry about that. So yeah, just a caveat. So I'm not as into worm composting just because it's harder to do these days in the summer. If, however, you're in an apartment or a condo and you don't have a yard, worm composting is a great way that people without a yard can make the space for compost. Without the space for composting, can still compost. And if you do have a setup where you can do that, worm compost is super good, super potent, kind of like plant superfood. So I did like to have that just concentrated worm compost. It was nice. So it can produce a very high quality soil supplement. It has great, just in addition to the nutrients, beneficial soil biology, and can be a quicker turnaround time, but lower volume than a compost pile. It's fun to keep a worm bin going with kids. Kids love worms in most cases if you expose them young enough. It's more responsibility than a cool compost pile, and you need to keep them cool. You also want to keep that same kind of wrung out sponge moisture level. If you buy a worm bin online, things like this are common and you're paying like $100 and you don't need all of this. And in fact, if you're keeping the right moisture level for your worm bin, this thing that they advertise where you can have what's called leachate or the worm juice that goes down at the bottom and you can use as a soil supplement, you shouldn't be creating that anyways. That's a sign of too much moisture. So you will need worms though. If you know someone with a worm bin, you can get some from them and start slow and save money. Or you can order, some people in their communities will have like a local worm farm. I don't know of anyone near us. So you would order them online, and there's a cost. Usually you'd start with about 500 worms or so for a normal home-sized worm bin, which is going to be about $45 plus shipping. There's a few different brands that sell them online. And remember, different than night crawlers. Some people grow night crawlers for fishing bait. We use red worms for composting. Those are the ones that like the kind of compost and veggie conditions. And they're not native, but oftentimes just because they have gotten all over the place, you will find them in rich garden soil these days. And then you're going to have some sort of container, and I'll show you in just a moment my favorite container style. And containers need what's called bedding. And so you're going to be adding your food scraps to your worm bin, but you need something else. The most traditional thing that people did for a long time was shredded paper or newspaper, and that still works, but it can get very matted once it's moist, and it can be hard to kind of have the loft. It can go anaerobic. The best thing that I've found for worms, the kind of most surefire thing, is to use what's called coconut coir, which is the kind of coconut husks, not the shell, just the husk material, the fibrous material, which is dried out and compressed into a block, which you can get. And then you can add that block or a part of that block to a bucket. They kind of give you, usually on the package, the amount of water to put in, and it turns into this very lofty, almost like potting soil material. Available online, or often you can also get it from local hydroponic stores, which seem like they're in almost every community these days in Southern California. And that's a great bedding to start with, and then to add your worm food into, and remember to keep it moist. So what to feed? If happy, worms will eat up to half their body weight per day in warm weather, but they'll slow down in cold weather. It's going to be a little bit of trial and error to figure out how much and how often to feed your worms. Too much food, if you see it really rotting a lot, will attract flies and gnats and stuff like that. Vegetable scraps and fruit scraps are normally where it's at, but nothing high acidity. No citrus, no pineapple, and also no onions. And also banana peels tend to attract fruit flies a lot. So if you have it inside, you don't want to do that. If you have another compost pile, I just wouldn't bother. Particularly good are greens, any lettuces, kale, any of that sort of stuff, melons, apples, in moderation, so there's not too much acidity, coffee grinds, but a little bit of coffee grinds, avocados, little bits and things like that they love. Root vegetables are slow to break down, but especially the smaller the pieces, the better, because they're shredders. They have tiny little things. And actually what the worms are eating are the bacteria that are growing on those breaking down veggies, but they will consume the veggies. They're actually digesting the bacteria, and then everything they poop out is great in beneficial soil biology and great in nutrients. And so this is all you need. You don't need that $100 setup. And you can actually drill holes in the bottom of these and stack them up multiples high if you want that same kind of multiple level situation. But for most of us, just a wide tote. I always go for the highest quality ones. So the Rubbermaid ones are a little bit more flexible, higher quality plastic. And then if you are going to have it inside, if there is a little bit of extra juice on the bottom, having just another lid on the bottom of a larger tote can help. And so this is ours. And then with holes, drilling holes in the bottom and then some holes on the side for aeration. And the holes on the side could be a little bit bigger. We just have a little bit more in them, but this worked well for us. It doesn't need to be any particular pattern, just enough. And make sure, like on a bottom like this, that there's sufficient holes in the lowest part. Probably would be a little bit better with some holes along the edge too, just in case some liquid accumulated there. But this worked well for us for many years. And then we just had it in the shadiest corner of our backyard. You don't want it to get hit with direct irrigation all the time. That sprinkler was disconnected. And then on top of the lid, just because raccoons and stuff can get attracted if they're going through the yard, we have a larger lid and a rock. Also helped keep the rain off of it as well if it rained. And so there was the lid, also with holes in it. And then here's looking in. You can see our coconut coir and all the scraps in between. And even that coir is a mix now of worm castings and the coconut coir, and things being slowly broken down. And you can see all the worms in there. And that's pretty much it. Shade is necessary.
cool for where to locate it, and they might need to come inside in heat waves. And you don't want them to get blasted by a bunch of rain, which will make the soil too wet in the winter. So in the winter, under an overhang or wintering in the garage is normally nice for them, but might get too hot in the summer. And then the one thing I don't have a slide on is, but it's very simple, about harvesting. So if you end up harvesting out a couple of worms when you do harvest and they end up in your garden bed, that's just fine. But the easiest thing once there's a lot of worm compost and you're ready to harvest is, for a number of weeks, just start feeding only on one side of your worm bin. Once all of the food is broken down in the other side, those worms are going to all go to where there's food. Then you can harvest this side, put in some new bedding, put in some new food, and then start only feeding on the other side. Same thing. And that's going to be the easiest way to harvest your worm bins when they're available. So we're about to move on to a final quick survey when I start answering questions. But I hope this has demystified compost and mulch and given you some really straightforward strategies of things that we can do at home without needing our compost piles to be treated like additional pets, and just really simple ways of guiding you towards making some choices for mulches in your landscape area. As I launch the final survey and answer questions, I will leave up this page, which just has some of the links that we mentioned earlier. And so I am going to launch just a quick final survey, which if you can please fill out, I would really appreciate it. Thank you for staying 5 minutes over time already. We had a lot to cover, and it's sometimes hard to fit all of that in and answer questions. So here's just a few quick questions. And then in addition to answering the questions, if you have any other feedback in the chat, I would love to know. If there's something that you thought was really practical that you know you're going to use, I'd love to know that. If there's something that you had been confused about related to compost that you now understand, I'd love to know what that is to make sure that I keep teaching things that way. And if there's something that you were expecting that you didn't get out of today, or you thought was unclear, I'd love to know as well, because we're always tweaking this presentation before we represent it. And so with that, I will start answering all of the questions as people fill out the survey. From Wen Lin, is it okay to add fruit seeds or pits to compost? Yeah, fruit seeds and pits are not going to harm the compost. I don't worry about it. I don't separate them out. They all end up in there. Seeds occasionally will germinate, but the plants won't grow for long, especially if there's like vegetable seeds. Fruits, like things like peach pits or things like that, they normally just won't break down, but eventually they get sifted out or they just end up getting mixed in with the compost. So I don't worry about it. They're not going to cause any harm. So someone was having problems with the survey. That's for submitting. That's no problem if it's not working for you. Worries. Okay. Can straw be substituted for wood chips in composting? Yeah, if straw is what you have access to, then yeah, you can use straw as the nitrogen component in composting. Make sure it's straw and not hay. Hay has the actual seed in it, and that seed is high in nitrogen. So if you do have hay, I mean, you can compost if it's like spoiled hay, but it's going to be a little higher in nitrogen. And if it's not fully composted, then those seeds could germinate in the new landscape wherever it's used. Okay, from Scarlett, good question. Can you pile it under a tree with shade, or will it damage the tree? If it's a large established tree, then it should be fine. Yeah, it generally is okay to have a contained compost pile underneath a tree. Okay, question about bokashi. I've never used bokashi to compost, so just to mention for other people who might be interested, bokashi is a very specific, completely different type of composting that is a very controlled anaerobic composting where you're actually adding specific inoculant microorganisms to do that. And it can work well for very small scale indoor composting. So Chrissy and Mark used it in an apartment. Yeah, I don't know too much about it. I know some people have been successful, thank you for the feedback, because I will keep that in mind as another kind of successful story if people are asking about very small scale. You don't get to do a lot of volume. It's more like a waste reduction strategy. Great for people in condos or apartments without yards. So can hay be substituted for wood chips in composting? Straw is better than hay. You can use hay if you need to, and you wouldn't necessarily want to buy like brand new good hay. That'd be pretty expensive. But if there's spoiled hay, but yeah, just keep an eye on if it seems like things are getting a little too hot, too anaerobic, and yeah, I just. For the cool composting, actually, I'd much rather people do straw than hay, because the seeds are probably still going to be viable once it goes into the new landscape if you use hay. Okay, what do you suggest for your compost if you live in an area where it's wet for many months of the year, prevent it from getting too wet? You can absolutely have a compost pile underneath an overhang, which is a good way to go. If you're going to be having a large compost pile, though, tarps. You can put, especially when it's cool and rainy, you can put a tarp over your compost pile. You don't want to do it down super, super tight, ideally, because you do still want some airflow, but you can use tarps. And if you're really into composting, you can look online. I've not seen them cut small. I'm surprised that I haven't seen anyone selling it, but for like large scale composting operations, there are specific tarps that are available. But again, the ones I've seen online, it's like you need to buy a huge, huge tarp, and they're expensive because they're highly engineered things. But there are tarps available specifically for compost where it allows airflow, but it will sheet water off the top of it. And that's what are used in large, large compost piles in areas where it rains a lot. But yeah, during the wet months, even in Southern California, if we're going to have a series of storms, I'll just loosely put a tarp on top of the compost, and then just make sure that like not too much water accumulates. I need to kind of like toss the tarp off to get some water off the top of it every once in a while. Okay, good question. What is the reason to put the brown or the carbon materials first in the compost bin? Not that crucial with cool composting, but it's just the wood chips is a nice kind of loose aerated, whereas just the first layer of vegetables would kind of compact down a little bit more. And so it's just a small touch. And because I'm using wood chips for that, and wood chips are given away for free in my community, I can always have access to it as well. Okay, from Connie. I put my kitchen scraps and yard trimmings in a bucket and cover it only at night. Add a little water once a week and mix it with the materials. I hope my compost works this way. Cover it only at night. Yeah, I mean, if it's, I can't quite tell from your description, if it's actually but if it's actually in a pile, and yeah, you're mixing your kitchen scraps. And if you have enough carbon, you're mixing it once a week and adding a little water, keeping that wrung out sponge, it should work that way. Susan has a metal compost tumbler and loves it. Interesting. Okay, great. Thank you very much for the feedback, Susan. Good to know. Okay, from Jan, came in late, curious where you can purchase wood chips for my small composting. Most landscape materials yards, like the kinds of place where you can buy soil or gravels or things like that. They have big bins and they like load it with tractors. Will also sell like a mixed mulch where it's just different kinds of wood all ground up and some little branches, like that works. Or a lot of communities, will give away through municipality wood chip mulch for free. And so you can use that. If you happen to be near where we are in Montclair, Southern California, then like we always keep a big pile of mulch that we get donated in our parking lot that the community can take for free. And that's the stuff that I use as well. Okay, just saw a comment come in from Kathy. I will mention that. So I didn't even mention cocoa mulch, which does smell good. And I don't even see it sold that much in Southern California anymore.
but it is like cocoa shells, and at least used to be something that people used as a mulch. But just like chocolate, is definitely toxic to dogs and not great for some other animals. So yeah, if there are going to be any dogs around, don't use cocoa mulch. But cocoa mulch also cost an arm and a leg and doesn't have as many of the benefits of a mixed wood chip mulch. But yeah, good comment, Kathy. Thank you. From David, how important is turning the pile? I have a plastic one that collapsed because of my turning. Maybe I turned it too much. If you are trying to do a hot compost pile, absolutely essential. For a cool compost pile, not essential. And in fact, I don't normally ever turn my cool compost piles. All I do is a little bit of light mixing in the top layer when I add. So I have my cap of wood chip mulch from the last time I added material. When I add my new vegetable scraps, I just mix the top few inches a little bit and add it on. So I don't ever really turn the pile. If you are using a one like mine, where it's kind of the flexible plastic, you wouldn't want to try to turn it in that. What you do is I would just unbutton the side, remove the whole plastic thing, reset it up next to where my compost pile is, and then flip all the materials back into it. But again, for my cool composting approach that I do, I don't ever even do that. Let's see. Okay, so we're getting to some older ones. I'm going to be checking if people are still there. Okay, from Dennis, are there disadvantages to using playground chips for mulch? If the playground chips are like a natural wood chip and that's what you want to use, sometimes I see playground stuff is like rubber. Yeah, don't do that. Playground chips, if they're like a natural wood chip and that's what you want to do, you can do that. Sometimes some of the playground chips, it's not necessarily just one thing. The ones that I've seen sold are sometimes a little softer and they're more like wood shavings. A normal wood chip mulch, like we talked about, would generally be better. But yeah, sometimes playground chips are just kind of like a more uniform wood chip. And if there's less species diversity in terms of the inputs, you're not going to get the full benefits as those things break down of like the soil benefits possibly, but you'll get all the same benefits from covering the soil. Okay, from Seta, how do we know when and where to go for your yearly mulch giveaway program in Rancho Cucamonga? That is not our yearly mulch giveaway program. Our mulch giveaway program is in our parking lot at the Waterwise Community Center in Montclair, available all the time. And yeah, I do. Some of our local areas do have like occasional ones. I would try to call the city, or sometimes the water districts are involved in the mulch giveaway programs. So if you get your water from Cucamonga Valley Water District, you can also try calling them. Would be where I would try to start. I don't know off the top of my head when Rancho Cucamonga does theirs. Okay, let's see. Checking questions and making sure people are still here. Okay, it's from Laura. Do you recommend using a specialist hot composting bin? Not necessarily. There's no particular bin that's better for hot composting. I've seen hot composting work in every style of bin, as well as just big open piles. It's really all about the input, the moisture level, the consistent temperature checking. So you do need a compost thermometer, and then turning as necessary, much more than the actual bin. So question from Dennis about pine needles.
Would you recommend or stay away from pine needles for mulch? Can I use it as a component of mixed mulch with other materials? Absolutely. Where in the South, where there's pine trees all over the place, actually, it's called pine straw mulch because there's so much of it. Is a common like traditional way of mulching gardens. That's fine. It doesn't break down in the same way, but if pine needles is what you have and the look works for you, then go for it. Either mixed with other things or just by itself. In terms of like maximum benefit for the soil, probably mixed with other stuff would be good. But yeah, pine needles are just fine to work with if that's what you have. So from Seta, tried composting with kitchen scraps which attracted critters. What do you suggest to throw in there? So with critters, one of those enclosed style compost bins would be the first thing. And then the other thing is making sure that your carbon nitrogen ratio, right? Nitrogen ratio. So like if like wood chips to vegetable scraps, if things were a little too high, too much vegetable scraps or a little too much of that rotting smell coming, that could really attract critters. So maybe a little bit more wood chip would be something to help, especially on the top. After you add, kind of capping it with that wood chip. So it's like already adding the wood chips for what will be needed the next time you add vegetables, can definitely help cut down on the smell, which might attract critters. Okay, from Padma. When I'm digging, I'm always afraid that I'm chopping up my earthworms, which makes me very sad. Do earthworms get hurt a lot, and do they cope with this process? I don't want to harm any creature from activities. Yeah, good question. Once you get really good soil, that sometimes happens. And I try to be careful too. It does happen. And I feel bad. You can't, a couple of things. One, earthworms. So sometimes people say when you cut an earthworm in half, it turns into 2 earthworms. And that's not really true. But from most wounds, if you nick them or even sever part of them, they can regenerate. The earthworms do have an incredible ability to do that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is a couple of things. One, if you do your, after you dig your compost into your vegetable garden the first time, if you're talking about your vegetable garden soil, and then if you're only adding compost as that top dressing layer, but not digging it in after that, you're going to be doing a lot less of that disturbance of earthworms, fungus, anything like that. So that's one thing. When you sift your compost pile, you don't end up chopping up earthworms or anything like that. You'll see them, but you can either allow them to be in the compost, or you can put them into your new compost pile where they should thrive. And then the last thing I will just say is that even if you do occasionally accidentally hurt one, just know that if you hadn't been doing that kind of gardening, then there wouldn't be nearly as much of a kind of microclimate supporting this whole active biological community within that area. That's appropriate for that style of gardening. You don't need all of that active biological community in that exact same way in your native plant area, where there's a different kind of more dry land adapted biological community, but you won't see as many worms, especially during the dry parts of the year. But if you're building kind of this beneficial ecosystem in your yard and you have all of that life, occasionally you're going to hurt something unintentionally, but you're going to be cultivating and supporting so much more life that I consider it absolutely worth it. We do the best we can. Okay. See, moving on. Okay, checking. Okay, it's from Gurpreet. I hope I am not totally mispronouncing your name. How do you control unwanted plants such as weeds in a mulch surface? Good question. Once the weeds do come up, it's harder. Like you can in an unmulched surface, open soil, you can use like a hoe or things like that. Once you have a mulched surface with wood chip mulch, you can sometimes use a hoe, but really hand pulling is the main thing. So kind of thinking about that as, some areas, if there's a lot of weed pressure, might be better to continue to control the weeds even a little bit more beforehand. However, the good thing about putting mulch down is that not as many weed seeds germinate because they don't have access to the sunlight after.
So generally mulching does help with weeds. One thing you can do in small areas is something called sheet mulching or cardboard mulching, where you put down cardboard or heavy duty like brown painter's paper, couple of layers before you put down your wood chips. And that makes a temporary, fully biodegradable weed barrier, which will help from preventing weeds from coming up. And in fact, they'll kind of rot down underneath. And eventually after a year or so, it'll just kind of be gone. So that's something you can do. But then, yeah, there generally is a lot of kind of hand pulling involved is the answer. Overall, though, normally less weeds. Okay, from George, can I add compost in the summer under the hot sun? Yeah, you can. It won't damage your plants or anything. If you put compost down as a top dressing under the hot sun, the compost will dry out some, and some of that biological activity, especially towards the top of the compost, may suffer. So if you're going to be laying compost out in the middle of the summer, you might also think of laying the compost out and then immediately doing like a couple inch or two of wood chip mulch on top of it, just so that that compost is not getting hit directly from the sun. So these questions are answered. Okay, from George, if I buy a bag of compost Dr. Earth brand from the nursery and I put it in a cool area unopened, will it be helpful to break down the unbroken down soil in the compost? For just one bag, probably not. I mean, it's going to be okay. Like the stuff as it comes from like one of the more reputable brands like Dr. Earth, like as it comes to you, it's still going to be a good soil amendment. It's a good nutrient balance. It's not going to be bad for your soil. It's just not fully broken down as much as like a fully broken down home compost, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. If you need to bring in a large amount of compost and your only option is to bring it in from like a soil yard where that's not fully broken down, but you're bringing in like a yard or 2 yards, I have had situations where I will bring that in. I keep the moisture there and I do let it break down for another couple of months. But for just a bag or so of one of those premium products, you could just go ahead and use it. It's probably better to go ahead and use it because they're also inoculated with some other beneficial biology than to wait. Random question, but I can help with an answer from Waterwise. I live in Chino Hills, can't seem to grow lavender. Chino Hills pretty much has heavy clay soil that drains poorly, and lavender likes well-draining soil. Easiest thing for you to grow lavender would be grow it in a pot with cactus mix, and with a smaller lavender, that'll be an almost surefire thing. The other thing you can do is plant it a little bit high on the mound, or plant it a little bit high on the mound and add some compost to the local area where you're going to plant it, and that might help increase drainage a little bit. Okay. Talked about coffee grounds some, so just good. So I had mentioned earlier, don't add sand into clay, and George asked, what about adding gravels or decomposed granite? Same thing. Really, to be successful, if you're really trying to grow like succulents or something into clay soil, you basically anticipate by volume, you're going to have to add about 50% sand and or gravel into that clay. And that's just not viable unless you have like one small bed and you're going to highly amend it and do the work because you really want to grow like a little cactus display. What would be even more viable, though, if you're really trying to do that, is just create a mound, leave the clay soil on the bottom, bring in some nice sandy loam soil from a soil yard, maybe in the bottom foot of it, mix 6 inches of that new soil, sandy loam soil, into 6 inches of your native soil to create like a transition zone that's going to be 50-50, and then build a mound with imported from a soil yard, well-draining soil. And then you can, grow some succulents or plants that need well-draining soil or whatever. The best thing for clay soil is just to focus on growing plants that are well adapted to clay soil. And there's so many great plants that are well adapted to clay soil. That's just fine. And if you are interested in some of those, on our Inland Valley Garden Planner website, which is at inlandvalleygardenplanner.com,
If you go to the plant finder section, it's a searchable database, you can click plants for clay soil, and it will come up with all sorts of great local recommendations for Southern California. Okay, let's see. From Kai. Stray cats keep entering my garden. What mulch can I use? I live in a mobile home park. We're not allowed to use bark because it's flammable. So depending on what plants you're going to use. Okay, if stray cats keep entering your garden because they're just checking things out or chasing lizards or something like that, cats will continue to enter your garden. You're not going to have a mulch type that's going to keep the cats out. However, if they are using your garden like a litter box, which does happen, if it is appropriate for your plant type, using a gravel mulch, and not a like tiny gravel mulch, but something like a pea gravel or a little bit larger, and then maybe mixing in some cobblestone and stuff, that should be less attractive to the cats. Oh, good question. What's the shelf life of compost? In general, if you're making your compost, as soon as it's done, it's going to be at its best and you can use it. Within 6 months of when that compost has been finished is when it's going to be best. That's when it's still going to have the most biological activity. And remember that through that time, you need to keep that moisture level. If it dries out a lot, you're not going to lose all your biological activity, but you will lose a significant amount. The activity will stop, and then when it's remoistened, only some of it would come back. Okay, let's see. Oh, so many more questions have come in. It's already 12:30. I can do maybe about 10 more minutes. I will get to as many as I can. Thank you everyone for staying. I can't believe we still have 43 people half an hour after the end of the class. Okay. Okay, how do you keep ants out of the compost and worm bin? If they go in, is it harmful? Seasonally, I will get more ants and then sometimes less ants in my compost bin. I don't have a like silver bullet solution to it, but I will say that when my compost pile, if my compost pile tends to get a little bit drier, it's more attractive to ants when it's kept at that evenly moist situation. I tend to see fewer ants in it. There will always be some ants in the compost bin. They can be very problematic in the worm bin. So if you have a worm bin, what I have done is, sometimes like find a way to prop the worm bin up, which will get it. I definitely don't have the worm bin on the ground. Find a way of propping it up and trying to have it be a little bit less accessible to the ants. Okay, getting there. Okay, question about cold weather and snow with compost. A cool compost pile will pretty much stop during cold weather. Might have a little activity, but things will definitely slow down. A true hot compost pile will sometimes have enough internal just kind of activity going on, microbial activity, to keep going. I know that from talking to someone who ran compost piles in Milwaukee, even in the winter, and kept up the heat. But I don't have much information for you other than that. I would reach out to maybe a local school with a agricultural extension program or cooperative extension, and you could probably find local information on that. So a question from Leanna. Yeah, if you go to the very top of the chat, you will see a link to our YouTube channel, and there is a recording on there right now from the last time I taught this topic. And then eventually, after some editing, I'll probably swap that with this recording. But that's available right now, so you can watch that this weekend if you want to.
if you have partially composted manure, where would it go in your compost bin? You could just add it in as like a new nitrogen, like high nitrogen compost part. So, mixing it with the wood chips as if it was vegetables, it'll just be more potent. But yeah, anything partially composted can go back through if it dries out or something like that. From Gail, I don't know the particulars about worm bins in low temperatures, but yeah, I'm pretty sure if they're stuck in that worm bin, if they can't escape and the temperature gets too low, I'm pretty sure that they will perish. It might be something where you might need to bring them in. From George, about gorilla hair mulch. Is it good for insulating the soil and suppressing weeds? It will do both of those things. It just has those other drawbacks that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, those two things it will do, just like any other wood-based mulch. So anonymous, if they're still there, who is coming from, oh, nope, not still here. Okay, so that was a very specific question. I will skip that one. Nancy, are you still there? Occasionally I get a foamy substance on the surface of my compost pile. What is it, and is it a problem? Is it potentially a slime mold? Is it like if it's a dry foamy substance, that's probably a slime mold, which is not a problem. Slime molds, I would encourage you, I don't have too much time to get into them. They're really cool organisms, and I encourage you to just look up and just read a little bit about them online. They're kind of incredible. They're these single-celled soil organisms, which for some reason that's still not fully understood to science, something stimulates them to come together and become this dry foamy looking thing, is how some of them come together, and it almost becomes temporarily like this multicellular organism. They're really interesting. They just break down decomposing organic matter, so not a problem. The only thing is they are a mold, so they can, like if you break up that foam, it can send up spores, which you don't really want to be like breathing in, just like any mold spores. But I've never had them in my compost bin, but they do occur just in mulch surfaces, like out in a garden or a landscape, and especially like we'll see them in Southern California sometimes like after it rains and then starts to dry out. So maybe that would stimulate it in your compost pile. But yeah, look up slime mold and see if it matches any of the pictures. That would be my guess. Even though the ones that we often get are not really slimy looking, some of them are. Oh, it's wet. I would still look up slime mold. It could still be that. Or if not, a wet foamy thing, I'm really not too sure. The other thing would be if you are local in Southern California, I guess the best thing to do probably would be to take a picture, see if you can find a local master gardener program or a cooperative extension program. And usually they have an email line where you can send pictures and ask, and someone will probably be able to help you out, or maybe it might be even willing to do some research for you and figure it out. That's a really interesting one. Okay, that's got us through all of the questions. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Lots of really great questions. I hope you all learned something today, and have a good rest of your weekend.